Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It genuinely helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference for us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. Also, if you enjoy these deep dives into the stories they don't want you to know, hit that subscribe button. It keeps us going. Now, let's get into it. The silence after the explosion. 73 seconds. That's all it took for the American space program to fracture on live television. That's how long 7 human beings had left to live while millions watched. That's how much time passed between ignition and catastrophe on the morning of January 28, 1986. But here's what should keep you awake at night. Here's what transforms this from tragedy into something darker, something more calculated, something that reveals how institutions protect themselves at any cost. Those 73 seconds weren't unexpected. They weren't unpredictable. They weren't even surprising to the people who understood the physics involved. Engineers knew. They knew with the kind of certainty that comes from data, from mathematics, from watching rubber lose its flexibility in cold water. They knew that launching Space Shuttle Challenger in freezing temperatures was playing a game of physics that had only one possible outcome. They said so, repeatedly, urgently, desperately. They spent hours on a conference call the night before the launch, pleading with managers to delay. They presented charts. They showed data. They explained in the clearest possible terms that the O-rings would fail, that hot gas would escape, that the shuttle would not make it to orbit. And they were overruled. Not because their data was wrong, not because their conclusions were flawed, but because other priorities, schedule, politics, public perception, mattered more than the lives of 7 astronauts. Then, after the explosion, after the fireball bloomed against the Florida sky, after debris rained into the Atlantic Ocean, after 7 people died exactly as predicted, NASA began a different kind of operation. Not a rescue operation. Not even just an investigation, but a suppression operation. The goal was simple: control the narrative, minimize the appearance of foreknowledge, protect the institution, ensure the shuttle program survived, and for years it worked. This is the story of what NASA knew, what they chose to ignore, and what they worked tirelessly to bury in the aftermath. This is the story of how truth-tellers were punished, how documents were classified, how testimony was softened, how the worst details were quietly omitted from public statements. This is the story of the warnings that were ignored, the engineers who were silenced, and the culture of institutional self-preservation that killed 7 people and then tried to hide its own culpability. This is the story of the silence after the explosion. And it should terrify you, because the same institutional patterns that killed the Challenger crew would repeat themselves 17 years later, killing 7 more astronauts when Columbia disintegrated over Texas. Some lessons, it seems, are too expensive to learn, especially when acknowledging them would mean admitting that powerful institutions sometimes value their own survival more than human life. Chapter 1. The Day America Watched. Let's start with what everyone saw. The moment that burned itself into the national consciousness. January 28, 1986, 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Kennedy Space Center, Florida. Space Shuttle Challenger sits on Launch Pad 39B. The sky's impossibly blue and bitterly cold. Inside the orbiter, 7 people are strapped into their seats. Commander Francis Scobie, Pilot Michael Smith, Mission Specialist Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, Payload Specialist Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, selected from over 11,000 applicants to be the first private citizen in space. Krista's presence is why millions are watching. School children across America are gathered in gymnasiums and classrooms. Teachers stand smiling at the back of rooms. Krista's own students watch from New Hampshire. Her family watches from the VIP area at Kennedy. She has 73 seconds left to live. The countdown proceeds. T-minus 10, 9, 8. The main engines ignite. 7, 6, 5. The shuttle vibrates. 4, 3, 2, 1. The solid rocket boosters fire. The bolts detonate. Challenger lifts off. The crowd cheers. The shuttle rises beautifully, climbing on a pillar of flame and white smoke. The ascent looks perfect. Everything is nominal. Challenger, go at throttle up. Roger, go at throttle up. Commander Scobie's voice is calm, professional. It's the last transmission anyone will hear from Challenger's crew. 73 seconds after liftoff, the sky tears itself apart. A massive fireball blooms where Challenger should be. The shuttle disintegrates. Large pieces tumble through the air, trailing smoke. The solid rocket boosters spiral away like bottle rockets gone mad, corkscrewing on trails of white smoke. Then the sound arrives. Dull, heavy thumps that hit you in the chest. The sound of catastrophic structural failure. For several seconds, no one makes a sound. Everyone is frozen, brains struggling to process what eyes are seeing. Then a voice comes through the speakers, controlled and professional. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. Major malfunction. Not explosion. Not disaster. Not the death of 7 human beings broadcast live to millions. A major malfunction. That choice of words is the first act in what will become a long, coordinated effort to manage how this disaster is understood. In mission control, controllers watch telemetry signals disappear. Someone is crying. Someone is frozen at their console. In classrooms, teachers reach for remotes with shaking hands. In Concorde, someone turns off the television. Children just watch their teacher die. But in conference rooms at NASA and Morton Thiokol, a different horror is unfolding. Some people are experiencing the terrible confirmation of being right, about something they desperately wanted to be wrong about. Roger Boisjoli, sitting in Utah, watches the replay. He doesn't need to wait for the investigation. He knows exactly what happened. The O-rings failed, just like he said they would, just like he begged management to understand they would. He's going to carry this knowledge for the rest of his life. 7 people just died in a disaster he saw coming, tried to prevent, documented and argued against. And a darker thought is forming, about how NASA will explain this, about whether telling the truth will be welcomed or punished. The explosion was public. Millions saw it. But the warnings, the conference call that lasted for hours, the engineers begging NASA not to launch, that happened in private, in conversations that can be summarized, softened, reframed. The answer, it will turn out, is as little as possible. Chapter 2. The Night Before. Rewind 18 hours, January 27th, 1986. Late evening, conference rooms at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama and Morton Thiokol's facility in Utah are connected by telephone. The topic is weather, specifically temperature. The forecast for tomorrow morning shows overnight lows dropping into the 20s Fahrenheit. That would make January 28th the coldest shuttle launch in program history. For NASA officials, this means ice concerns. For Morton Thiokol engineers, this triggers alarm bells that have been ringing for months. They know about the O-rings. They know what happens to rubber in cold temperatures. The solid rocket boosters are constructed in segments stacked vertically. Between each segment sits a joint sealed by rubber O-rings. When the booster fires and pressure builds, the O-rings must seal completely to prevent hot gas from escaping. But rubber loses flexibility in cold. It becomes stiff, slow to seal, and if it doesn't seal, hot gas escapes. This isn't theoretical. Engineers have documented O-ring erosion on previous flights. They've noticed a pattern. The colder the temperature at launch, the worse the O-ring performance. Now, with temperatures forecast at 24 degrees, the engineers are terrified. Roger Boisjoli is a senior engineer who's been studying the O-ring problem for over a year. He's seen the data, he knows the physics, he knows what's going to happen if they launch in this cold. The teleconference begins after 8 p.m. The Morton Thiokol engineers present their concerns. They show charts demonstrating the relationship between temperature and O-ring erosion. They explain the physics. They present their conclusion. Do not launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The forecast is for 24 degrees. NASA officials push back. They ask questions. Is there definitive proof that temperature is the critical factor? Can the engineers quantify the risk? What's the basis for the 53-degree threshold? The engineers explain again. But they're being asked to prove a negative, to demonstrate with absolute certainty that launching will result in failure. And that's not how engineering works. You can only demonstrate that the risk is unacceptably high. Alan MacDonald, the director of Morton Thiokol's Space Shuttle Solid Rocket Motor Project, supports his engineers. He tells NASA clearly that Morton Thiokol cannot recommend launching in these conditions. I would not want to have to defend this launch decision in front of an investigation board. The call continues for hours. NASA pushes back harder. Someone asks why Morton Thiokol is trying to change launch criteria on the eve of a mission. The implication is clear. You've approved 24 previous launches. Why is tomorrow suddenly a problem? The subtext is understood by everyone. Morton Thiokol is a contractor. NASA is the customer. Delays are expensive. Delays affect contracts. Delays could cost jobs. Someone from NASA suggests that Morton Thiokol take time to reconsider their recommendation. Morton Thiokol management request a private caucus. They mute their end of the conference. In Utah, the dynamics shift. The engineers make their case again, but now they're presenting to their own management, who have different priorities. Boijoli speaks, his voice strained. Gentlemen, we have data showing a ring erosion correlates with temperature. We have physics showing rubber loses flexibility in cold. I cannot in good conscience recommend launching in these conditions. If those O-rings don't seal, the shuttle will be destroyed. People will die, and we will have seen it coming. His words hang in the air. Then the management discussion begins. It's not about engineering anymore. It's about relationships, contracts, the shuttle program schedule, political realities. Jerry Mason, Morton Thiokol's senior vice president, turns to Bob Lund, the vice president of engineering, and says something that will be quoted for years. Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. It's a candid acknowledgement that they're about to make a decision based on something other than engineering judgment. When Morton Thiokol management returns to the conference call, they deliver a new position. Despite their engineers' objections, despite the data, Morton Thiokol tells NASA the launch is acceptable. Not ideal, not recommended, but acceptable. Alan MacDonald at Kennedy Space Center refuses to sign the launch approval. I won't sign it. I can't put my name on this decision. Someone else signs. The launch is approved. The teleconference ends. Roger Boisjoli drives home in silence. His wife describes how he looked when he came through the door. Devastated, defeated, angry. He tells her the shuttle is going to launch. He tells her he's afraid. He lies in bed, unable to sleep, running through the physics. The temperature, the rubber, the seal rate. He knows what's going to happen. The O-rings will be too cold. They won't seal. Hot gas will escape. 7 people are going to die because of a decision made in a conference room to avoid delaying a launch. At Kennedy Space Center, Alan MacDonald is having a similar morning. He didn't sleep well. The ice is everywhere when he arrives. Everything about this launch feels wrong. He walks the pad with the ice team. He looks at the solid rocket boosters, at the joints where the O-rings sit, cold and stiff and unable to do their job. The countdown continues. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger lifts off, and in conference rooms in Utah and Alabama, engineers watch their television screens with expressions of dread, already knowing what they're about to witness. Chapter 3. The Coldest Morning. January the 28th. Dawns clear and bitterly cold. At Kennedy Space Center, the launch pad looks like something from another world. Ice encases the entire structure. Icicles, some several feet long, hang from pipes and platforms. The water sound suppression system, designed to dampen the acoustic shock of launch, has frozen into strange ice formations. The mobile service structure, normally just steel and scaffolding, has transformed into an ice sculpture. Technicians and engineers conduct their pre-launch inspections wearing heavy coats. Their breath forms clouds in the frigid air. They document the ice, photograph it, measure it, assess whether it poses a risk. The concern is straightforward. During launch, vibrations and heat could cause ice to break off and strike the shuttle. Ice hitting the orbiter's heat shield tiles could cause damage. Ice ingested by the main engines could cause catastrophic failure. Ice is a debris hazard. and debris during launch is always dangerous. The ice team, a specialised group responsible for monitoring and clearing ice before launch, conducts multiple inspections. They find ice everywhere. They clear what they can, but there's too much. The temperature is too low. Ice forms faster than they can remove it. Launch is delayed while managers assess the risk. Multiple holds are called. The countdown clock stops and restarts. Television cameras capture the ice-covered pad, and announcers mention the unusual cold as a factor in the delays. But here's what doesn't happen. The O-ring issue isn't discussed again. The teleconference from the night before isn't mentioned. The engineers' concerns aren't revisited. Morton Thiokol has given their approval. NASA has accepted that approval. The decision to launch has been made. The ice concerns are addressed through inspection and analysis. Managers determine that enough ice has been cleared, or will melt before launch to reduce the risk to acceptable levels. The countdown resumes. Inside Challenger, the crew waits. They've been strapped into their seats for hours, going through holds and delays, waiting for the launch window. They're professionals. They trust the engineers and flight controllers. They trust the system. If NASA says it's safe to launch, it's safe to launch. At 11:38 a.m. the countdown reaches 0. The main engines ignite. Challenger shudders as thrust builds. The solid rocket boosters ignite. The explosive bolts detonate. The shuttle lifts off. And immediately something goes wrong. High-speed cameras recording at hundreds of frames per second capture something that won't be noticed until later, until after the disaster, when analysts review every second of footage looking for clues. At 0.678 seconds after ignition, at less than 1 second into the flight, black smoke puffs from the aft field joint of the right solid rocket booster. 8 distinct puffs, each lasting a fraction of a second. The smoke is dark grey, almost black. It's not combustion smoke. It's not normal exhaust. It's the smoke of burning O-ring material, of hot gas escaping through a gap that shouldn't exist, of a seal that has already failed. The smoke stops. The escaping gas, superheated and carrying aluminum oxide particles from the burning fuel, immediately creates a temporary seal. The aluminum oxides clog the gap, plugging the leak. It's not a real fix. It's not a proper seal. It's just debris temporarily blocking a hole. But it holds, for now. Challenger continues to climb. The ascent looks normal to observers. The shuttle rotates onto its programmed trajectory. Velocity and altitude increase. Everything appears to be proceeding perfectly. At 37 seconds, Challenger experiences maximum dynamic pressure, the point where the forces of speed and atmospheric resistance are at their peak. The entire vehicle flexes under the stress. The solid rocket boosters bend slightly. The external tank compresses. The orbiter vibrates. And in the right solid rocket booster at the aft field joint, the temporary aluminum oxide seal is disturbed. The plug shifts. The gap reopens. At 58 seconds, cameras detect a small flame on the side of the right solid rocket booster. It's barely visible at first, just a flicker of yellow-orange against the white casing, but it grows. At 64 seconds, the flame has become a blowtorch. Superheated gas is now streaming from the joint at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit, cutting into the booster's casing like an industrial torch cutting through metal. The flame is aimed directly at the lower strut attachment connecting the booster to the external fuel tank. At 72 seconds, the strut fails. The structural connection between the right solid rocket booster and the external tank is severed. The booster, still producing enormous thrust, pivots on its upper attachment point. The nose of the booster swings around and smashes into the upper section of the external tank. The external tank is not designed to withstand this kind of impact. Its walls are thin, designed to minimize weight. When the booster hits it, the liquid hydrogen tank ruptures. Simultaneously, the force of the collision causes structural failure in the liquid oxygen tank. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, the two components of the shuttle's main engine fuel, begin mixing. In normal conditions, they're kept separated and burned in controlled fashion in the main engines. Now they're mixing in open air, in massive quantities. At 73 seconds, the mixture ignites. The explosion is enormous. The entire external tank erupts in flame. The orbiter, still attached to the tank, is engulfed in the fireball. Aerodynamic forces, the sudden change in thrust vectors, and the explosive force of the igniting fuel tear the shuttle apart. Challenger disintegrates. The wings separate. The tail section breaks away. The crew cabin, reinforced and structurally independent from the rest of the orbiter, separates intact from the disintegrating fuselage. The solid rocket boosters, their fuel not yet exhausted, spiral away from the explosion. They're equipped with range safety systems, explosive charges designed to destroy them if they threaten populated areas. Range safety officers, watching in horror from their stations, send the destruct commands. The boosters explode, adding more smoke and debris to the sky. The crew cabin, now separated from the orbiter, begins to tumble. It's falling, but it hasn't hit the ocean yet. It's intact. And inside, some of the crew are conscious. We know this because of what's found later when the wreckage is recovered. At least 3 of the personal egress air packs, emergency oxygen supplies worn by the crew, have been manually activated. This requires a deliberate action, reaching up and flipping a switch. It means that at least 3 crew members were aware and functioning after the breakup. The crew cabin falls for 2 minutes and 45 seconds. At terminal velocity, tumbling through the air, the occupants would have experienced extreme forces. They would have known they were falling. They would have known what was coming. At impact, travelling over 200 miles per hour, the crew cabin strikes the ocean's surface. The deceleration is instantaneous and catastrophic. Death is immediate. On the ground, in mission control, there's chaos. Telemetry from Challenger has ceased. Tracking cameras show debris instead of a shuttle. Flight controllers are trying to make sense of data that stopped coming, trying to track fragments, trying to understand what happened. Outside, at the press site and viewing areas, people are standing in stunned silence. Some are crying. Some are frozen in disbelief. Parents are grabbing their children, shielding them, turning them away from the television screens. In classrooms across America, teachers are frantically reaching for remote controls, turning off televisions, trying to process what they've just shown their students. Some are crying. Some are trying to maintain composure, to comfort students, to explain something that can't be explained. And in conference rooms at NASA and Morton Thiokol, engineers and managers are experiencing the absolute worst-case scenario of being proved right. Roger Boisjoli, who spent hours the night before arguing against this launch, is watching the same television screens as everyone else. He knows immediately what happened. He knows the O-rings failed exactly as he predicted. He knows this disaster was preventable, and he knows that what comes next is going to be very, very complicated. Chapter 4. The first 24 hours. Within hours of the disaster, NASA holds a press conference. Officials express shock and grief. They describe the loss of 7 crew members as a terrible tragedy. They pledge full cooperation with investigations. They assure the public that they will determine what happened and why, and they say something else, something that later investigations will reveal to be at best misleading. They say there was no indication before launch that anything was wrong. This is carefully worded. Technically, immediately before launch, during the terminal countdown, there were no indicators of O-ring problems. You can't see O-ring condition from outside the booster. There are no sensors monitoring O-ring temperature or compression, so in the strictest sense there was no indication during the final countdown. But that phrasing obscures the larger truth. The truth that engineers had been warning about O-ring problems for months. The truth that a conference call the night before involved urgent objections to launching in cold weather. The truth that foreknowledge existed, even if it wasn't visible in the final minutes before liftoff. NASA's public statements in those first hours and days are focused on reassurance. They emphasize that investigations will be thorough. They praise the crew. They comfort the families. They maintain that spaceflight involves risk, but that every reasonable precaution was taken. Behind the scenes, a different process begins. Documents are collected, conference call records are reviewed, telemetry data is preserved, wreckage recovery efforts are organised, and quietly, participants in the January 27th teleconference are instructed to document their recollections of that discussion. Some of those participants later report feeling pressure, subtle but real, to frame their documentation carefully, to emphasize uncertainties rather than certainties, to describe the conference call as a normal pre-launch discussion rather than an urgent argument about safety, to avoid language that suggests NASA ignored clear warnings. This is the beginning of narrative management, not an organised conspiracy in the traditional sense, just institutional self-preservation, the natural tendency of large organisations to protect themselves, to control information, to manage perception. Roger Boisjoli and Alan MacDonald are among those asked to document their recollections. They write detailed accounts of the teleconference, including their objections, the data presented, and management's decision to override the engineering recommendation. These documents, and others like them, will eventually become part of the investigation record, but in the immediate aftermath, they're treated as internal communications, classified or restricted, not for public release. The message to engineers and contractors is clear without being explicitly stated. Cooperate with the investigation, document what happened, but be careful about speaking publicly. Remember that the shuttle program's future is at stake. Remember that NASA's reputation is fragile. Remember that premature conclusions could harm the investigation. It's a chilling effect. Not overt censorship, just gentle pressure, just institutional norms, just the understanding that speaking out of turn, saying too much too soon, could have consequences. And for most people, that's enough to ensure silence. Chapter 5. The Rogers Commission. On February 3rd, 1986, less than a week after the disaster, President Ronald Reagan establishes the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident, quickly known as the Rogers Commission after its chairman, former Secretary of State William Rogers. The Commission's membership is carefully selected. It includes astronauts Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride. It includes test pilots and aerospace engineers. It includes former NASA officials. And, somewhat unexpectedly, it includes Richard Feynman, a theoretical physicist from Caltech, a Nobel Prize winner known for his brilliance, his directness, and his complete lack of concern for political niceties. Feynman is a wild card. He's not part of the aerospace establishment. He's not beholden to NASA. He's not worried about preserving relationships or protecting budgets. He's a scientist who asks uncomfortable questions and follows evidence wherever it leads, regardless of whose ox gets gored in the process. And that makes him dangerous from NASA's perspective. The Commission begins its work with public hearings and private briefings. NASA provides access to facilities, documents, and personnel. The agency cooperates fully, or appears to, but there's a careful choreography to that cooperation. Briefings are prepared, witnesses are coached, information is organised and presented in ways that shape the narrative. Initially, the Commission's investigation focuses on the technical aspects of the failure. Wreckage is recovered from the ocean floor. Engineers analyse the debris, particularly pieces of the solid rocket boosters. Telemetry data is reviewed, video footage is examined frame by frame. The O-ring theory emerges quickly. The black smoke at ignition, captured by high-speed cameras, points to a joint failure. The flame plume at 60 seconds confirms gas escaping from the right aft field joint. The wreckage of the joint itself, recovered from the Atlantic, shows clear evidence of O-ring failure and hot gas erosion. But establishing that the O-rings failed is different from establishing why they failed, and whether anyone knew they might fail. NASA's initial position, presented in briefings to the Commission, is that O-ring erosion had been observed on previous flights, but was considered an acceptable risk. The erosion was documented, analysed, and determined to be within safety margins. The cold weather on January 28th was an unprecedented factor, something outside the normal flight experience, something that couldn't have been fully predicted. This framing does several things. It acknowledges the O-ring problem, which is unavoidable given the physical evidence. It portrays the problem as known and managed, which suggests NASA was exercising appropriate oversight. And it characterises the cold weather as an unpredictable variable, which suggests the disaster wasn't preventable. It's a narrative designed to minimise culpability while appearing transparent. But the narrative starts to crack when the Commission requests internal documents and schedules witness testimony. Memos surface showing that engineers had classified O-ring failure as a Category 1 risk, the highest criticality level, meaning a failure would result in loss of vehicle and crew. Reports describe increasing O-ring erosion over multiple flights. Safety reviews document concerns about joint performance in cold weather. And then the Commission learns about the teleconference on January 27th. When Roger Boisjoli is called to testify, he doesn't hedge. He doesn't soften his language. He doesn't try to protect the institution. He tells the truth. He describes the conference call in detail. He explains the engineering concerns about cold weather and O-ring performance. He recounts his arguments against launching. He describes the data he presented. And he describes management overruling the engineering recommendation. His testimony is devastating. It directly contradicts NASA's public statements that there was no indication of problems before launch. It reveals that warnings were issued, documented, and ultimately ignored. NASA officials scramble to respond. They characterized the teleconference as part of normal pre-launch procedures, a routine discussion where various factors are weighed. They emphasized that the final decision to launch was based on all available information and judgment calls about acceptable risk. They argue that spaceflight inherently involves risk and that perfect certainty is impossible. But the damage is done. The Commission now knows that engineers objected to the launch. They know that those objections were documented. They know that management overrode those objections. And they know that NASA's initial public statements were, at best, incomplete. Chapter 6. Feynman's Investigation. While the Commission conducts formal hearings, Richard Feynman pursues his own parallel investigation. He's not content with official briefings and prepared presentations. He wants to talk to the engineers directly, to understand the technical issues without the filter of management and public relations. He visits NASA facilities, he asks basic questions, he requests demonstrations, and he quickly becomes convinced that there's a disconnect between NASA management and NASA engineering, between the official position and the technical reality. Feynman is particularly interested in risk assessment. He asks NASA managers to estimate the probability of catastrophic failure. They tell him the shuttle is extremely safe, with a failure rate of approximately 1 in 100,000 launches. Then he asks the engineers the same question. They give him a very different answer, 1 in 100. That's not a small discrepancy. That's a fundamental difference in understanding the actual risk involved in shuttle operations. Feynman digs deeper. He learns about the normalization of deviance, the process by which problems that occur repeatedly without catastrophic consequences gradually become accepted as normal. O-rings eroded on multiple previous flights, but the shuttle always made it to orbit successfully. So each new instance of erosion was compared to previous erosion, rather than to the design specification of zero erosion. As long as the erosion wasn't worse than before, it was considered acceptable. This is a dangerous way to operate a complex system. It's how you slowly, incrementally, without anyone making a single catastrophically bad decision, drift toward disaster. During a televised Commission hearing on February 11, 1986, Feynman performs a demonstration that becomes one of the most famous moments in investigative history. He's been provided with samples of O-ring material, small pieces of the same rubber used in the solid rocket booster joints. During a break in testimony, while cameras are still rolling, Feynman drops a piece of O-ring into a glass of ice water. He waits. After several minutes, he removes the O-ring and squeezes it with a small clamp. On camera, visible to millions of people watching the hearing, the compressed O-ring doesn't spring back. The cold has made it stiff, inflexible, unable to perform its sealing function. Feynman's voice, casual and conversational, delivers the conclusion. I believe that has some significance for our problem. It's a masterpiece of understatement. What he's demonstrated, simply and visually, is that cold makes O-rings fail. That this isn't complex or debatable, it's basic physics. And that anyone who understood this physics should have known that launching in freezing temperatures was dangerous. The demonstration is replayed endlessly on news broadcasts. It's simple enough for anyone to understand, and it makes NASA's claims of unpredictability much harder to defend. But Feynman doesn't stop there. He writes an appendix to the Commission's final report, a personal statement describing what he's learned about NASA's culture and decision-making processes. In the appendix, he describes the disconnect between management's rosy estimates of shuttle reliability and engineering's realistic assessment of risks. He describes the normalization of deviance, the acceptance of problems as routine. He describes the pressure to maintain launch schedules despite safety concerns. And he concludes with words that have become famous, words that cut to the heart of what went wrong, not just with Challenger, but with NASA's institutional culture. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. NASA attempts to exclude Feynman's appendix from the final report. They argue it's too critical, too personal, too harsh in its assessment of management. They suggest it should be softened or removed entirely. Feynman refuses. He tells the Commission that if his appendix isn't included, he'll remove his name from the report and publish his findings independently. The appendix is included, but it's placed at the back of the report, physically separated from the main findings, formatted differently, clearly marked as Feynman's personal observations rather than official Commission conclusions. It's there, but it's marginalised, which is exactly how you suppress inconvenient truth without technically hiding it. Chapter 7. What the transcripts revealed. As the Rogers Commission's investigation continues, more details about the January 27th teleconference emerge. Partial transcripts are released. Participants provide testimony. The full scope of the engineering objections becomes clear. But there's something odd about how this information is presented. Early summaries of the teleconference released by NASA and included in initial commission materials are notably incomplete. They mention that concerns were raised about cold weather. They note that Morton Thiokol initially recommended against launching. They record that Thiokol management eventually approved the launch. What they don't capture is the urgency, the desperation, the repeated warnings that this launch was dangerous. Roger Boisjoli later describes his frustration with how the conference call was characterized in official summaries. He says the documents made it sound like a routine pre-launch discussion, with normal engineering caution, rather than what it actually was, which was engineers begging management not to launch. Transcript sections are heavily redacted. Some conversations are marked as internal deliberative discussions and withheld from public release. Other sections are summarised rather than quoted verbatim. Why? The official explanation is standard bureaucratic practice. Government agencies routinely protect internal deliberations. Releasing full transcripts could expose individuals to litigation, could reveal proprietary technical information, could compromise NASA's ability to conduct future internal reviews. But there's another possible explanation, that the full unredacted transcripts would make absolutely clear that engineers predicted the disaster, that they stated their concerns explicitly and forcefully, and that management decided to launch anyway for reasons related to schedule and politics rather than engineering. And revealing that level of foreknowledge would make the disaster look less like an accident and more like a choice. Alan MacDonald's testimony provides some of the most damning details. He describes the pressure from NASA during the teleconference. He recounts being asked directly why Morton Thiokol was attempting to change launch criteria on the eve of launch. He describes the implication that another delay would have consequences for Morton Thiokol's relationship with NASA. He also describes the aftermath, the pressure to stay silent, the sense that speaking truthfully about what happened that night would be seen as disloyal or unhelpful. Other engineers report similar experiences. They describe being debriefed by management after giving testimony. They describe being asked to clarify their statements, to ensure they weren't being taken out of context, to remember that the shuttle program's survival depended on maintaining public and congressional confidence. None of this is illegal. None of it is even technically suppression. It's just the normal operation of a large bureaucratic organisation trying to protect itself after a disaster. But the effect is to minimise the appearance of foreknowledge, to soften the evidence of ignored warnings, to make the disaster seem more like bad luck than bad judgment. Chapter 8. The crew cabin question. There's another aspect of the Challenger disaster that NASA handles with extreme care. It's the question of what happened to the crew, and specifically whether they survived the initial breakup. When Challenger disintegrated at 73 seconds, the orbiter didn't explode in the conventional sense. The external tank ruptured and ignited, creating a massive fireball. Aerodynamic forces tore the shuttle apart. But the crew cabin, the reinforced compartment where the astronauts sat, was designed to survive certain types of structural failures. And it did survive, initially. The crew cabin separated from the disintegrating orbiter largely intact. It began tumbling toward the ocean, falling from an altitude of approximately 46,000 feet. For the families of the crew, for the public, the immediate assumption was that death was instantaneous. The fireball, the breakup, the violence of the disaster all suggested that no one could have survived even for a moment. But wreckage recovery tells a different story. In March 1986, search teams locate the crew cabin on the ocean floor. It's heavily damaged from impact with the water, crushed by the deceleration forces, but identifiable, and when it's recovered and examined, investigators find something that raises disturbing questions. At least 3 of the 4 personal egress air packs, emergency oxygen supplies worn by the astronauts, have been manually activated. These packs don't activate automatically. They require a crew member to reach up and flip a switch. This means at least 3 crew members were conscious, aware, and functional after the breakup. How long did they remain conscious? What did they experience during the fall? These are questions that NASA addresses very carefully in public statements. The official position, stated in press releases and reports, is that the crew likely lost consciousness very quickly due to depressurization of the crew cabin. They emphasized that the crew did not suffer, that any awareness was brief, that death was effectively instantaneous even if technically it occurred minutes later at impact. But the evidence is more ambiguous. The crew cabin's integrity after breakup is uncertain. Some analysis suggests it may have remained pressurized for at least some portion of the fall. The activation of the air packs suggests conscious action, and the timeline is inescapable. The crew cabin fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds before hitting the ocean. That's not instantaneous. That's not a brief moment of awareness. That's potentially nearly 3 minutes of knowing you're falling, of experiencing the tumbling, of understanding what's coming. NASA never emphasizes these details in public communications. The focus remains on the fireball, the breakup, the tragic loss. When asked about crew survivability, officials provide carefully worded statements about consciousness loss and lack of suffering. The specifics, the activated air packs, the full duration, the possibility of prolonged awareness, these details are mentioned in technical reports but not highlighted. They're available to anyone who reads deeply into the investigation materials. But they're not part of the public narrative. Why? Because the image of astronauts falling conscious through the sky, aware that they're going to die, is unbearable. It transforms the disaster from a sudden tragedy into a prolonged horror. And it raises questions about crew cabin design, about emergency escape systems, about whether anything could have been done differently. It's not technically a cover-up. The information is in the reports, but it's narrative management. Protecting the public from the worst details, protecting NASA from additional scrutiny, protecting the space program from questions about whether crew safety was given appropriate priority. Or, depending on your perspective, it's another form of suppression. Another example of controlling information to shape perception. Chapter 9. The Cost of Truth. Roger Boisjoli becomes a public figure after his testimony to the Rogers Commission. Media coverage portrays him as a hero, a whistleblower who tried to prevent the disaster. He receives awards from engineering societies. He's invited to speak at universities and conferences. But within Morton Thiokol, he's something else entirely. He's the engineer who publicly criticised management. He's the person who made the company look bad. He's a problem. After his testimony, Boisjoli is reassigned. He's removed from the solid rocket booster redesign team, the group working to fix the O-ring problem for future shuttle flights. It's the work he's most qualified to do, the work where his expertise would be most valuable. But he's excluded. Instead, he's given assignments with no real responsibility. Busy work. Tasks designed to keep him occupied but isolated. He's no longer invited to important meetings. His memos go unanswered. His colleagues avoid him. It's not a formal punishment. No one accuses him of wrongdoing, no one disciplines him officially. But the message is clear. Speaking the truth publicly, even when that truth is vindicated, comes with a cost. In 1987, Boisjoli takes medical leave for post-traumatic stress and depression. He never returns to Morton Thiokol. His career in aerospace engineering is effectively over. Years later, in interviews and speeches, he describes the experience. He talks about the isolation, the sense of being punished for being right. He describes the culture of silence that surrounded the disaster, the way people who had praised his engineering judgment before Challenger suddenly treated him as a pariah after he testified truthfully about what happened. Alan MacDonald's experience follows a similar pattern. After refusing to sign the launch approval and later testifying about the pressure to approve the launch despite engineering objections, he finds himself marginalised within Morton Thiokol. He's excluded from the redesign effort. His expertise is ignored. He's made to feel like his presence is unwelcome. It's a subtle form of retaliation, nothing that would hold up as formal discrimination, but effective nonetheless. Unlike Boisjoli, MacDonald fights back. He complains to Morton Thiokol management. He threatens legal action. He makes it clear that he won't be quietly pushed out. Eventually, after intervention from NASA and pressure from the media, MacDonald is reinstated to a leadership role in the redesign effort. But it takes months of fighting, months of stress, months of being treated as an obstacle rather than an asset. Years later, MacDonald writes a book about the Challenger disaster and its aftermath. The title is telling: Truth, Lies, and O-Rings. In it, he describes in detail the pressure to stay silent, the consequences of speaking up, and the institutional culture that punishes truth-tellers even when they're proven correct. These aren't isolated incidents. Other engineers and contractors who raised concerns, who testified honestly, who provided documents to investigators, report similar experiences. Not everyone is formally retaliated against. But many feel pressure. Many sense that their candour damaged their careers. Many understand that the institutional message is clear. Speaking uncomfortable truths is risky. Protecting the institution is rewarded. And that message ensures that future warnings, future concerns, future objections will be delivered more quietly, more carefully, or perhaps not delivered at all. Chapter 10. Columbia and the Pattern That Repeats. Fast forward 17 years. February 1st, 2003. Space Shuttle Columbia is returning from a 16-day mission. The crew of 7 has completed their science experiments and is preparing for re-entry. At 9 a.m. Eastern Time, over Texas and Louisiana, Columbia begins breaking apart. Superheated air, entering through a breach in the leading edge of the left wing, causes catastrophic structural failure. The shuttle disintegrates. Debris falls across multiple states. All 7 crew members are killed. The cause is foam insulation. During launch, a piece of foam broke free from the external tank and struck Columbia's left wing. The impact created a hole in the heat-resistant panels. During re-entry, atmospheric heating exploited that breach, and the shuttle was destroyed. Just like Challenger, Columbia's disaster was preventable. Just like Challenger, warnings were raised. Just like Challenger, those warnings were minimized or ignored. Engineers had noticed the foam strike during launch. Video footage showed the impact clearly. Requests were made to have the military photograph Columbia in orbit to assess potential damage. Those requests were denied. The consensus at NASA was that foam strikes, while not ideal, were not a critical threat. Previous shuttles had sustained foam strikes and returned safely. It's the normalization of deviance again. The same pattern that killed Challenger's crew. Problems that occur repeatedly without catastrophic consequences gradually become accepted as normal. As long as each new instance isn't worse than previous instances, it's considered acceptable, until the day it isn't. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board's final report, released in August 2003, is devastating in its criticism of NASA's organizational culture. The report describes the same problems identified after Challenger. The same disconnect between management and engineering. The same pressure to maintain schedules. The same reluctance to acknowledge risks that might delay missions. Board member Sally Ride, who had also served on the Rogers Commission investigating Challenger, notes the eerie parallels. The same failures, the same warnings ignored, the same tragic outcome. In testimony and in the report, investigators note that NASA had learned the technical lessons of Challenger, but failed to learn the cultural lessons. The O-rings were redesigned. New safety protocols were implemented. But the fundamental organisational problems, the pressure to minimise concerns, the normalisation of anomalies, the prioritisation of schedule over safety, these persisted, and they killed another 7 astronauts. Critics argue that Challenger should have been a wake-up call, that the loss of 7 lives should have fundamentally transformed how NASA operated. But it didn't. Or rather, it did for a while, but gradually, over years, the old patterns reasserted themselves. After Columbia, some former NASA engineers speak publicly about the parallels. They describe a culture where raising safety concerns is seen as obstructionist, where engineers who push too hard on safety issues are viewed as obstacles to mission success, where the institutional pressure is always toward finding reasons to proceed rather than reasons to delay. These criticisms echo what Roger Boisjoli and Alan MacDonald said about Challenger. The same culture, the same pressures, the same tragic outcomes. The question becomes unavoidable. If NASA didn't truly learn from Challenger, if the same organisational problems persisted and led to Columbia, was the Challenger investigation really about learning the truth? Or was it about managing the narrative, protecting the institution, and getting the shuttle program flying again as quickly as possible? Chapter 11, The Conspiracy of Silence. So what exactly is the Challenger conspiracy? It's not about aliens or sabotage. It's not about hidden causes or secret plots. The physical cause of the disaster is well documented and not disputed. O-rings failed due to cold temperature. Hot gas escaped. The booster casing burned through. The shuttle disintegrated. The conspiracy is about foreknowledge and suppression. Engineers knew the O-rings were a problem. They documented it. They raised concerns. They argued against launching in cold weather. And on the night before the launch, they explicitly recommended against proceeding. NASA management, under pressure to maintain schedules and demonstrate the shuttle's reliability, overrode those objections. That's not alleged. That's documented in commission testimony, in internal memos, in transcripts of the teleconference. The conspiracy is what happened next. NASA's initial public statement suggested no one knew there was a problem before launch. That characterization was, at best, misleading. At worst, it was an intentional effort to minimize the appearance of foreknowledge. Internal documents about the O-ring concerns and the teleconference were classified or restricted. Summaries downplayed the urgency of the engineering objections. Transcripts were redacted. Testimony was carefully framed. Engineers who spoke publicly about the warnings they issued faced career consequences. They were isolated, reassigned, marginalized. The institutional message was clear. Protecting NASA's image mattered more than acknowledging uncomfortable truths. Details about the crew's final moments, the activated air packs, the duration of the fall, were mentioned in technical reports but not emphasized publicly. The narrative focused on the explosion and the fireball, not on the possibility that some crew members were conscious during the fall. All of this is documented. None of it is speculative. The Rogers Commission report, testimony transcripts, later interviews with participants, books written by engineers involved, all confirm these basic facts. So why did NASA do this? Why suppress information? Why punish truth-tellers? Why manage the narrative so carefully? Because the alternative was unthinkable. If NASA fully acknowledged that engineers had explicitly warned against the launch, that management overrode those warnings for schedule-related reasons, that the disaster was therefore preventable, the consequences would have been catastrophic for the agency. Congressional investigations would have gone deeper. Criminal negligence might have been alleged. Budget cuts would have been severe. The entire shuttle program might have been permanently grounded. NASA's response was institutional self-preservation, not a coordinated conspiracy in the traditional sense. Just the natural behaviour of a large bureaucratic organisation trying to survive a disaster of its own making. Protect the institution, minimise culpability, control the narrative, ensure the program continues, and the cost of that response. The truth was delayed, softened, suppressed. The people who tried to prevent the disaster were punished, and the cultural problems that led to Challenger were never fully addressed, which meant they persisted until they killed 7 more astronauts on Columbia. Epilogue: The Quiet Truth. The Challenger disaster is remembered as one of the darkest moments in American history. 7 people died on live television while millions watched. Children saw their teacher disintegrate in a fireball. A nation's confidence in its space program was shattered. But the real tragedy isn't just that Challenger exploded. The real tragedy is that it didn't have to happen. And the deeper tragedy, the one that should haunt us, is what happened after the explosion. How the truth was managed. How warnings were minimized. How the people who tried to prevent the disaster were punished for being right. Let's be absolutely clear about what happened. Engineers knew. They documented their concerns in memos that still exist, that you can read today if you want to. They raised alarms in meetings that were recorded. They spent hours on a conference call the night before the launch, presenting data, explaining physics, making their case in the strongest possible terms. Do not launch in these temperatures. The O-rings will fail. People will die. They weren't speculating. They weren't being overly cautious. They were reading the data and following the physics to its logical conclusion. This was preventable. This was predictable. This was foreseen. And they were overruled. Not because their data was wrong. Not because their conclusions were flawed. But because other factors, schedule pressure, political considerations, the desire to avoid another delay, these mattered more to management than the lives of 7 astronauts. That's documented. That's not conspiracy theory. That's in the commission testimony, in the transcripts, in the books written by the engineers who were there. Then, after the explosion, after the sky tore apart and debris rained into the ocean, and 7 people died exactly as predicted, NASA began a different kind of operation. Not just an investigation, not just a recovery effort, but a narrative management campaign. The goal was simple: acknowledge the technical failure while minimizing the appearance of foreknowledge. Admit the O-rings failed while obscuring the fact that engineers predicted they would. Accept responsibility in the abstract while avoiding specific accountability for the decision to launch despite warnings. It worked. For years it worked. The public narrative became tragic accident, technical failure, lessons learned. The shuttle program was redesigned and resumed. NASA's reputation recovered. The space program continued. But the truth, the full truth, remained buried in appendices and technical reports and testimony that was summarized and softened and carefully framed. The teleconference on January 27th became described as routine pre-launch discussions rather than what it actually was. Hours of engineers desperately arguing against launching. Hours of management pressure to approve despite objections. Hours of institutional priorities overriding engineering judgment. The crew's final moments, the activated air packs, the 2 minutes and 45 seconds of falling. These details appeared in technical documents, but were never emphasized publicly. The narrative focused on the fireball, the instant of breakup, the mercy of sudden death, not the horror of prolonged awareness during an unsurvivable fall. The engineers who spoke truth, who testified honestly about what happened, who refused to participate in the narrative management, they were punished. Not officially, not in ways that would create legal liability, but through isolation, reassignment, career destruction. The institutional message was unmistakable. Protecting NASA matters more than uncomfortable truth. And 17 years later, it all happened again. Columbia, 7 more dead. Same organizational culture. Same pressure to maintain schedules. Same normalization of risk. Same warnings ignored. Because NASA learned the wrong lessons from Challenger. They learned to redesign the O-rings. They learned to improve some technical systems. But they didn't learn the fundamental lesson. That institutional self-preservation, the desire to protect budgets and schedules and reputations, can kill people. That when engineers raise alarms, you listen. That reality doesn't care about your schedule, your politics, your public relations strategy. That nature cannot be fooled. Richard Feynman understood this. His appendix to the Rogers Commission report cuts through all the institutional defensiveness and political careful language and states the truth plainly. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. Nature wasn't fooled on January 28, 1986. The O-rings failed exactly as physics predicted. The cold made the rubber stiff, just like dropping rubber in ice water demonstrates. The seals didn't work. Hot gas escaped. The booster burned through. The shuttle exploded. 73 seconds of flight time. Physics following its inevitable course. But NASA tried to fool the public. They tried to make the disaster seem less preventable than it was. They tried to minimize the foreknowledge. They tried to protect the institution at the expense of truth. And here's what should keep you up at night. It worked. The narrative was managed successfully. The shuttle program survived. NASA's reputation recovered. The truth stayed buried just enough that most people never fully understood what happened. Until Columbia proved that the same patterns, the same institutional dysfunction, the same prioritization of schedule over safety, could and would kill again. How many engineers at NASA watching Columbia disintegrate over Texas in 2003 felt the same sick recognition that Roger Boisjoli felt watching Challenger explode in 1986? The terrible confirmation of having been right about something you desperately wanted to be wrong about. How many warnings were ignored in the lead-up to Columbia? How many concerns were minimized? How many people knew something was wrong but stayed silent, having learned from Challenger's example what happens to truth-tellers? These are questions we can't fully answer, because the same institutional patterns that suppressed truth after Challenger persisted after Columbia. The same careful narrative management, the same protection of the institution over uncomfortable facts. Here's what we know for certain. 7 people died on Challenger because managers overrode engineers' warnings. That's documented fact. Engineers who spoke truth about those warnings faced career consequences. That's documented fact. NASA managed the narrative to minimize the appearance of foreknowledge and preventability. That's documented fact. The same institutional culture that led to Challenger persisted and contributed to Columbia. That's documented fact. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are documented realities, supported by commission findings, testimony transcripts, internal memos, and the accounts of people who were there. The conspiracy isn't that NASA hid the cause of the disaster. The conspiracy is that NASA tried to hide the fact that the disaster was preventable, that people knew it was coming, that warnings were ignored, that institutional priorities killed 7 astronauts. And they succeeded partially in that suppression. The truth exists, in reports and documents and testimony. But it's not the story most people know. It's not the narrative that's stuck in public consciousness. Most people remember the fireball, the teacher in space, the tragedy, the technical failure. Few people remember the conference call that lasted for hours the night before, the engineers begging management not to launch, the explicit recommendation against proceeding, the decision to launch anyway for reasons that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with schedules and politics and institutional pressure. That's the silence after the explosion. The explosion was loud, public, witnessed by millions, impossible to hide. The warnings were quiet, private, heard by few, easy to suppress. And in that gap between what everyone saw and what only a few knew lies the real Challenger conspiracy. Not a secret plot, not a hidden agenda, just institutional self-preservation, operating the way large bureaucratic organizations always operate when their survival is threatened. Protect the budget, maintain the program, control the narrative, minimize culpability, punish dissent. 7 people died. 7 more would die 17 years later, and the institutional patterns that killed them persisted, because acknowledging the full truth, accepting complete responsibility, admitting that powerful people made choices that killed astronauts for bureaucratic reasons, that truth was too expensive to tell, so it was managed, softened, buried just enough, available to anyone who looks hard enough but never quite part of the story everyone knows. Think about that the next time you hear about a government agency assuring the public that everything is safe, that all precautions were taken, that no one could have predicted what happened. Think about Roger Boisjoli spending hours presenting data that showed exactly what would happen if they launched in the cold, being overruled, watching it happen anyway, then watching his career destroyed for having the courage to testify honestly about it. Think about the crew of Challenger strapped into their seats, trusting the system, trusting the engineers, never knowing that engineers had begged management not to launch that morning. Think about 2 minutes and 45 seconds, the time it took for the crew cabin to fall from the sky, the time some of them might have been conscious, aware, understanding what was coming. The time NASA doesn't like to talk about because it makes the disaster too specific, too personal, too horrible. Think about the fact that none of this had to happen. That if management had listened to engineers on January 27th, if institutional priorities hadn't overridden safety concerns, if truth had mattered more than schedules, 7 people would have lived. And think about the fact that the same patterns repeated 17 years later, killing 7 more. The explosion everyone saw. The warnings only a few witnessed. The truth institutions tried to bury. That's not just history, that's a pattern, a playbook. A reminder that when powerful organisations are threatened, truth becomes negotiable. Whistleblowers become problems, and protecting the institution takes precedence over everything else, including human life. Sleep well. The file shouldn't have existed. Clara Rains had spent 3 years analysing radar anomalies for Sentinel Defence Analytics, cross-referencing FAA flight paths with weather patterns, satellite debris, and the occasional flock of geese that confused outdated tracking systems. She'd seen every kind of glitch, every data corruption, every bureaucratic mislabelling that could make a spreadsheet lie. But she'd never seen 3 separate federal databases, FAA, FEMA, and CDC, share the same incident code for events that had nothing to do with each other, until now. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March 2026 when the pattern emerged. Clara sat in her cramped Arlington apartment, the glow of dual monitors casting blue light across her face. Outside, the distant hum of the metro's last train faded into silence. She'd been running a routine check on rural radar anomalies, the kind of busy work that kept her contract renewed, when the algorithm flagged something unusual. 3 incidents, 3 different states, 3 different months. January 14th. Meteor sighting, Cisco, Utah. FAA logged unusual radar signature. Local fire department responded to reports of impact. FEMA designated it ENV-071KD. Follow-up. Closed within 18 hours. February 3rd. Mass illness event, Durbin, West Virginia. CDC investigated reports of 17 residents experiencing identical hallucinations. Designation, ENV-071KD. Follow-up, attributed to contaminated well water. Case closed. March 9th. Missing persons. Loma, Montana. 4 hikers disappeared during clear weather. FEMA deployed emergency assessment team. Designation, ENV-071KD. Follow-up. Individuals found disoriented but unharmed, no further action. The designation code was the hook. ENV-071KD didn't match any standard federal classification system. Clara had memorised FEMA's taxonomy during her first year at Sentinel. Every prefix, every suffix, every bureaucratic shorthand that turned disasters into data points. This code was wrong. Or more accurately, it was right in a way that shouldn't be possible. She pulled up the incident reports. Each one listed the same cleanup team in the footnotes. Department. 7 Response Unit. Clara opened a new browser tab and accessed the Federal Agency directory through her contractor credentials. She typed Department 7, no results found. She tried variations. Department 7, 7th Department, Division 7. She expanded her search to include the Office of Personnel Management Database, the Congressional Budget Office's agency listings, even the Freedom of Information Act reading room, and nothing. The clock read 12:33 a.m. Clara leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking in the silence. In Washington, agencies didn't simply not exist. Even the most classified operations, JSOC's Grey Fox, the NSA's Tailored Access Operations, the DOE's Nuclear Emergency Support Team, left paper trails, budget line items, redacted organisational charts, acronyms in appropriations bills. But Department 7 had no shadow, no trace, no echo in any database she could access. She should have closed her laptop and gone to bed. Should have dismissed it as a data entry error, some clerk in 3 different agencies accidentally typing the same wrong code. Should have remembered that curiosity was a liability in her line of work. Instead, she downloaded all 3 incident reports to an encrypted drive, cleared her browser history, and decided to dig deeper. That decision would be the last normal choice she'd ever make. Clara spent the next week building a timeline. She worked carefully, methodically, the way her father had taught her during the summer. He'd tried to get her interested in bird watching. Pattern recognition, he'd said, pointing to migration routes on a map. It's not about seeing one bird, it's about seeing where they all go. She pulled archived news reports from the 3 towns. Cisco, Utah. Local paper ran a brief story about the meteor, included a quote from a resident who described men in dark suits arriving before the fire department. The follow-up article, published 2 days later, made no mention of suits or federal agents, just a meteorite fragment donated to the local college. Durbin, West Virginia. Nothing in the news archives at all. Clara found a deleted social media post, cached by a web scraper, from a resident claiming government people had quarantined the elementary school for testing. The post had been removed within 6 hours. Loma, Montana. The missing hiker's story made regional news, but the official report was bland. 4 hikers from Seattle got separated from their trail group, spent a night in the woods, experienced mild hypothermia and confusion. A park ranger found them the next morning. The incident report listed no ranger's name. Clara cross-referenced the dates with satellite imagery from commercial providers. Cisco, thermal bloom consistent with impact, followed by ground vehicles arriving within 2 hours, at 3 a.m, long before local emergency services were notified. Durbin, no unusual activity visible, but cell tower data showed a 5-hour communications blackout in a 3-mile radius. Loma, cloud cover obscured the area during the critical 48 hours. Every lead led to a gap. Every question led to silence. On Thursday evening, Clara broke protocol. She called an old colleague from her graduate program at Georgetown, Marcus Webb, who'd taken a position with the Defense Intelligence Agency's Open Source Analysis Division. They met at a coffee shop in DuPont Circle, the kind of anonymous place where half the customers were having quiet conversations about things they shouldn't discuss in public. "You look like you haven't slept," Marcus said, stirring sugar into his espresso. "I need you to look up something for me, quietly. I'm not pulling classified files, Clara. Not asking you to. Just check the DIA's unclassified organisational records. Tell me if you've ever heard of Department 7. Marcus frowned. "Department 7 of what?" "That's what I'm asking." He pulled out his phone, spent 2 minutes scrolling, then shook his head. "Nothing." "Why? You ever come across an incident code ENV071KD? "No, that's not a standard format." "Where'd you see it?" Clara hesitated. "Just something that crossed my desk. Probably nothing." Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. If it's probably nothing, why do you look scared? She didn't answer. Instead, she asked, you ever hear stories about cleanup teams? Federal, but not from any specific agency? You mean like NEST? They're DOE? No, unmarked, just present when weird things happen, then gone. Marcus set down his cup. Clara, if you've stumbled onto something operational, you need to report it through proper channels and then forget about it. Seriously, I've seen contractors lose their clearances for less. What if the proper channels don't acknowledge it exists? Then it definitely doesn't exist, and you should stop asking. He stood, leaving a 20 on the table. I mean it. Some doors stay closed for good reasons. Clara watched him leave. She finished her coffee in silence, then took the metro back to Arlington, checking over her shoulder 3 times before entering her building. That night she found the photographs. She'd requested field documentation from the Cisco incident through a Freedom of Information Act query, a routine request that should have taken months to process. Instead, the response arrived in 4 days, a PDF containing 12 heavily redacted pages and 6 photographs. The photos showed the impact site. Scorched earth, a shallow crater, scattered fragments of dark material, standard meteor documentation. But in the background of the third photo, Clara spotted something the redaction team had missed. 3 vehicles parked in formation, dark SUVs with no visible markings. She zoomed in. The resolution degraded, but she could make out a small emblem on the lead vehicle's door. White numbers on a black circular background. 7-13-4. Clara saved the image, enhanced it using forensic software, and confirmed what she'd seen. The badge was deliberately minimal, no agency name, no seal, just numbers. A designation that meant nothing to anyone outside a very specific circle. She ran the number sequence through pattern analysis. 7-13-4 could be a unit identifier, a radio call sign, a budget code. Or it could be nothing, random numbers chosen precisely because they conveyed no information. But if they meant nothing, why use them at all? Clara opened a secure document and began writing everything down. Every incident, every connection, every gap in the official record. She backed it up to 3 separate cloud services under false names, printed a hard copy, and sealed it in an envelope she hid behind her bathroom mirror. At 2:17 a.m., her phone rang. The number was blocked. Clara stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. Silence. Hello? Nothing. Not even breathing. Just the faint hiss of an open line. Who is this? The call ended. Clara checked her phone logs. The incoming call didn't appear. No duration, no number, no record it had ever happened. She didn't sleep that night. Friday morning, Clara arrived at work to find an email waiting in her inbox. The sender was listed as Federal Records Compliance Office, an entity she'd never heard of. The subject line read, FOIA request number 2026-03-FAA-7719-DENIED. She opened it. Your request for field documentation regarding incident ENV071KD, Cisco, UT, has been reviewed and denied under 5 U.S.C. Section 552B1. The requested materials are classified in the interest of national security. No further information can be provided at this time. This denial is final and not subject to administrative appeal. Clara checked her FOIA tracking portal. Request number 2, 026-03-FAI-7719 didn't exist in the system. She'd never been assigned that number. More importantly, she'd already received the documents. She had them saved on her laptop. Someone was trying to erase what she'd already seen. Clara closed her email and opened a private browser window. She navigated to a file-sharing service and uploaded every document she'd collected, setting the folder to auto-delete in 72 hours unless she renewed it. Then she sent the link to herself at 3 different email addresses, including one she'd created in college and hadn't used in years. Insurance. She spent the day working on routine tasks, acting normal, laughing at a co-worker's joke about the office coffee machine, but every time someone walked past her cubicle, she tensed. At 4:30 p.m, Her supervisor stopped by. Gerald Costner, a former Air Force intelligence officer who'd transitioned to the private sector and spent most of his time in meetings. He smiled, casual and friendly. "Clara, you have a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" "Just wanted to check in. You've been putting in a lot of late hours this week, everything okay?" "Yeah, just trying to clear some backlog before the quarterly review." Good. Listen, I noticed you put in a FOIA request last week, Cisco Meteor thing." Clara's stomach tightened. "Yeah, just routine. Wanted to see if there was any debris that might explain the radar signature." "Find anything interesting?" "Not really." "Pretty standard meteor documentation." Gerald nodded, still smiling. "Great. Hey, just so you know, FOIA requests need to be cleared through my desk first. Contractor policy. No big deal, just make sure to loop me in next time." "Of course. Sorry about that." "No problem." He tapped her cubicle wall twice, a casual gesture. "Have a good weekend." Clara waited until he was out of sight before exhaling. She pulled up her company's contractor handbook and searched for the FOIA policy. There was no requirement to clear requests through supervision. Not for unclassified materials, which was what she'd requested. Gerald was lying. At 5 p.m, Clara packed her laptop, took the elevator down to the parking garage, and sat in her car for 10 minutes watching the exit ramp. No one followed her out. No unfamiliar vehicles lingered nearby. She drove home through rush-hour traffic, taking random turns, doubling back twice. Nothing. She was being paranoid. Had to be. But when she arrived home and checked her apartment, she found her bathroom mirror slightly askew. The envelope she'd hidden behind it was gone. Clara stopped sleeping. She'd read somewhere that the human body could survive on 4 hours of sleep a night for weeks, though cognition degraded over time. She allowed herself 2-hour shifts, setting alarms, keeping her phone in her hand even while unconscious. Every creak in the building woke her. Every car door slam outside sent her to the window. She didn't go back to work on Monday. Instead, she called in sick, then drove to a public library in Silver Spring and used their computers to continue her research. The librarian barely glanced at her ID. Clara accessed the commercial satellite archives again, this time focusing on the Montana incident. Loma was a town of 487 people, surrounded by national forest, the kind of place where hikers went missing just often enough that local search and rescue teams had a routine. The 4 missing hikers, Sarah Donnelly, Marcus Price, Jennifer Torres and Kyle Hammond, had been experienced backcountry campers, all in their 30s, all from Seattle. The official Park Service report stated they'd been found 16 miles from their last known position, dehydrated and confused, with no memory of the intervening 31 hours. Medical evaluations showed elevated cortisol levels and minor abrasions, but nothing that explained their disorientation. Clara found a podcast that had covered the incident. The host interviewed a local sheriff who described the federal response as overkill for a simple rescue. When asked which agency had responded, the sheriff paused, then said, "They didn't say. Had badges, but I didn't catch the department." The podcast had been posted 3 weeks ago. Clara tried to access it now. The episode had been removed. The show's website listed all episodes except that one. She found a cached version through a web archive and downloaded the audio file. At timestamp 23:17, the sheriff said something she'd missed in the transcript. They set up a perimeter around the recovery site. Wouldn't let our people in until they'd secured the scene. I asked what they were securing. These were hikers, not criminals. Guy just looked at me and said, "Contamination protocol." Never explained what that meant. Contamination protocol. For missing hikers. Clara dug deeper into the background of the 4 individuals. Marcus Price's social media had gone dark after his rescue. His last post was from the trailhead, a photo of sunrise over the mountains. His Facebook profile still existed, but every post after the incident had been deleted. His friends' comments remained. "Glad you're okay, man. Call me when you can talk about it." She found a phone number for Marcus Price through a people search site and called it. The line rang 4 times before going to voicemail. His voice sounded tired. "This is Marcus. Leave a message." "Mr. Price, my name's Clara Rains. I'm a researcher looking into unusual federal responses to outdoor incidents. Was hoping to ask you a few questions about your experience in Montana last month. Please call me back at this number. It's important." She left her burner phone number, a prepaid cell she'd bought with cash that morning. 3 hours later, it rang. "Hello? You called about Montana?" The voice was male, cautious, not Marcus Price. "Who is this?" "Doesn't matter. You need to stop asking questions about that." "I just want to understand what happened." "No, you don't. Trust me, Marcus doesn't remember, and that's a mercy." "What do you mean he doesn't remember?" "I mean exactly what I said. Whatever they did to him, to all of them, it worked. He can't even talk about it without getting panic attacks. Leave it alone." "Who did something to him? Who are they?" The line went dead. Clara tried calling back. The number didn't connect. She sat in her car in the library parking lot, hands shaking. Someone was watching these incidents. Someone was intervening with witnesses, and someone knew she was asking questions. That night she found Major Emmett Crowley. Crowley's name appeared in a declassified Air Force memo from 1987, a routine personnel reassignment document that listed him as a radar technician, stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. Clara found his name again in a 2003 Veterans Forum post, where he'd commented on a thread about unexplained radar contacts. His post had been deleted, but the quote remained in someone's reply. "We tracked them for years." The official story was always weather balloons or equipment malfunction, but some of us knew better. She tracked him through public records to a small town in New Mexico, where he'd retired 10 years ago. His address led her to a trailer park outside Roswell. Ironic, Clara thought, given the town's history. She drove 17 hours straight, stopping only for gas and coffee. The landscape shifted from green to brown, humid to arid, dense to sparse. By the time she reached Roswell, it was late afternoon, the sun turning the desert gold. Crowley's trailer was clean but weathered, a wind chime hanging by the door. Clara knocked 3 times before an old man answered. He was thin, maybe 70, with sharp eyes that assessed her immediately. "If you're selling something, I'm not interested." "Major Crowley?" "My name is Clara Rains. I need to talk to you about Department 7. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He glanced past her, scanning the empty street, then stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The interior was sparse. A couch, a television, a bookshelf filled with aviation manuals and Tom Clancy novels. Crowley gestured to the couch and took a seat in a recliner opposite her. "How'd you find me?" "Public records. I'm a data analyst. Pattern recognition is what I do." "And what pattern led you to me?" Clara pulled out a folder containing printouts of everything she'd collected. 3 incidents, 3 different agencies responding with the same designation code, a cleanup team that doesn't exist in any federal database, and witnesses who either can't remember what happened or disappear from public record. Crowley took the folder, flipping through pages without comment. When he finished, he set it on the coffee table and leaned back. "You shouldn't be looking into this. Everyone keeps telling me that. No one tells me why. Because the people who run Department 7 are very good at making problems go away. And right now, you're a problem. So it does exist. Officially? Number? In practice?" He gestured at her folder. "You've already seen the evidence. They've been around since 1952, born out of Project Blue Book's classified annex. You know about Blue Book? Air Force program that investigated UFO sightings, closed in 1969. That's the public story. The truth is that Blue Book had 2 tracks. Track 1 handled the explainable stuff. Weather balloons, aircraft, Venus. Track 2 handled everything else. The cases where the physics didn't work. The cases where witnesses experienced shared delusions. The cases where something was left behind. Left behind by what? That's the wrong question. 7 doesn't care what causes the events. They care about containment. Their job is to maintain consensus reality. When something happens that contradicts what people believe is possible, 7 arrives and rewrites the scene. They're not covering up aliens or time travellers. They're erasing contradictions. Clara leaned forward. What kind of contradictions? Crowley stood and walked to his bookshelf. He pulled down a binder and handed it to her. Inside were photocopied documents, incident reports, budget memos, personnel rosters, all stamped with classification markings all decades old. 1974, Dulce, New Mexico. Entire town reported seeing geometric lights hovering for 6 hours. Hundreds of witnesses. News crews showed up. Then 7 arrived. Within 48 hours, every video was confiscated, every witness was interviewed, and the official story became military flares. A year later, half the witnesses couldn't remember seeing anything unusual. How is that possible? You'd have to ask them, but I've heard rumours. DARPA programs, neural interference tech targeted electromagnetic fields. They don't just erase evidence, they erase memory. Clear a page through the binder. Another incident. 1989, Shoshone National Forest. A group of hunters found a clearing where all vegetation had been desiccated overnight. The ground fused into glass. Department 7 response team arrived, declared the area contaminated and removed everything. Official explanation: lightning strike. Why are you telling me this? Clara asked. Because you're already in their crosshairs, and maybe if you understand what you're dealing with, you'll be smart enough to stop. Crowley sat down again. I spent 30 years tracking radar anomalies. I learned to recognise the pattern. Every few months something would happen. Time distortions, energy blooms, mass cognitive events. And every time, 7 would show up. They'd scrub the site, interview witnesses and disappear. I tried to compile a comprehensive report in 1995. 2 weeks later I was reassigned to a desk job in Alaska. The message was clear. But you kept records, copies, hidden, because I knew someone would eventually come asking. He looked at her carefully. You're not the first. Over the years, a few others have stumbled onto the pattern. Journalists, researchers, people like you. They ask questions, dig too deep, and then they disappear. Not violently. They just stop. New jobs in other states, sudden career changes. Sometimes they seem fine, just uninterested in the topic anymore, like someone flipped a switch. Clara's hands felt cold. What do I do? Stop, right now, delete everything, forget this conversation and move on with your life. And if I don't, Crowley sighed, then you'll meet them eventually. And when you do, you'll have a choice. Most people choose to forget. It's easier that way. Clara stood, clutching the binder. Can I keep this? I made it for you. But understand, possessing those documents makes you a target. They've already noticed you. Now you're carrying proof. Then they already know everything. Probably. Crowley walked her to the door. Good luck, Miss Rains. I hope you're smarter than I was. She drove back to her hotel room and spent the night scanning every page of Crowley's binder. Incident after incident, stretching back decades. The details varied, but the pattern remained consistent. Anomalous event, witness reports, Department 7 response, immediate cleanup, official explanation, fading memory. By 4 a.m, Clara had compiled a timeline that spanned 70 years. If Crowley was right, Department 7 wasn't just responding to unusual events. They were maintaining a specific version of reality, one where certain things simply didn't happen. But why? And on whose authority? She needed to see them in action. The alert came through on a Thursday morning. Clara had set up monitoring scripts across multiple platforms, FEMA dispatch channels, local news wires, social media, even amateur radio frequencies. She was looking for patterns, sudden federal mobilization, unexplained communications blackouts, stories that appeared and then vanished. At 7:43 a.m, her system flagged a cluster of social media posts from Thornton, Montana, population 1,122, located in a valley surrounded by national forest. The post described pillars of light visible above the tree line, lasting approximately 20 minutes before fading. One user posted a blurry photo showing vertical columns of luminescence, like aurora borealis constrained to narrow beams. By 8 a.m, several posts had been deleted. By 8:30, the local news site removed its brief article about the phenomenon. Clara checked FEMA's dispatch logs, no activity. FAA radar showed no unusual contacts. Weather Service reported clear skies. But at 9:15 a.m, her monitoring script caught a spike in encrypted radio traffic in the area, using frequencies associated with federal emergency response. She was in her car within 10 minutes. Thornton was a 9-hour drive from Roswell. Clara pushed her rental car to 80 miles per hour across empty highways, stopping only once for gas and energy drinks. She reached the Montana border by evening, the sky dimming to purple as she navigated through increasingly rural terrain. She arrived at Thornton just before midnight. The town was dark, most houses unlit, a single gas station glowing like a beacon on the main street. Clara parked at a motel on the edge of town and checked in under a false name, paying cash. In her room, she assembled her equipment: a digital camera with a telephoto lens, a radio scanner, binoculars, and a small drone she'd purchased 3 days ago. The drone was consumer grade but had a decent camera and could fly for 30 minutes on a single battery. At 1:30 a.m, Clara drove to the location where the light pillars had been reported, a forestry road leading to a hilltop with a view of the valley. She parked half a mile away and hiked the rest of the distance, carrying her equipment in a backpack. The hilltop offered a clear view. Below, Thornton spread out in a grid of streetlights and dark houses. Beyond it, the forest stretched into darkness. Clara set up her camera and waited. At 2:47 a.m, headlights appeared on the road below. 3 vehicles, dark SUVs moving in formation, no emergency lights, driving with deliberate speed. They turned onto a side road leading into the forest, toward the area where the light pillars had been reported. Clara launched the drone, keeping it low, using the trees as cover. The infrared camera showed the vehicles stopping in a clearing 2 miles into the forest. Figures emerged, 6 people in plain dark clothing, moving with practiced efficiency. They unloaded equipment from the vehicles: metal cases, tripods, devices Clara didn't recognize. One person set up a perimeter using what looked like portable fencing. Another assembled a sensor array on a telescoping pole. Clara zoomed in with her camera. The vehicles had badges on their doors. Even in low light she could make out the design. A black circle, white numbers, 7-13-4. She was watching Department 7 work. For the next hour, Clara documented everything. The team moved methodically, scanning the clearing with handheld devices, collecting samples of soil and vegetation, assembling what looked like lead-lined containment pods. One person stayed by the vehicles holding a tablet, occasionally speaking into a radio. At 4:15 a.m, Clara noticed something. One of the team members was looking around, scanning the tree line. He raised binoculars and pointed them directly toward her position. She froze. The man lowered his binoculars and raised one hand. He waved. Clara's breath caught. She was 300 yards away, concealed in darkness behind trees. There was no way he could see her, but he'd waved directly at her. She recalled the drone, packed her equipment, and ran back to her car. Her hands shook as she started the engine. She drove back to the motel, watching her mirrors, expecting headlights to appear behind her. Nothing. In her room, Clara immediately transferred the drone footage and photos to her encrypted cloud storage. She reviewed the images, zooming in on every detail. The team's equipment was unmarked. The vehicles had no license plates, just federal government tags with alphanumeric codes. She checked her camera's GPS data. Every photo she'd taken showed the correct location coordinates except for one, the image of the man waving. That photo's GPS coordinates placed it in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Impossible. Clara packed everything, checked out of the motel at 5:30 a.m. and started driving south. She wanted to put distance between herself and Thornton, get back to populated areas, somewhere with witnesses, somewhere safe. At 6 a.m. she stopped at a diner for coffee. While waiting for her order, she checked her phone. 3 new emails, all from addresses she didn't recognize, all sent within the last 20 minutes. She opened the first one. It was empty except for an attachment. The photo of the man waving at her. The same photo she'd just taken. But this version was different. The timestamp showed it had been taken 2 minutes before she'd pressed the shutter. The second email contained a satellite image of the hilltop where she'd been standing, marked with a red circle. The image was time-stamped 2:46 a.m, 1 minute before the vehicles had arrived. The The third email had no attachment, just one sentence. "You're very good at this." Clara deleted the emails, paid for her coffee without drinking it, and got back in her car. She drove for 3 hours, taking random exits, changing directions, before finally stopping at a rest area outside Billings. Her laptop was in the trunk. She opened it, expecting to find her files intact. Every photo from Thornton was gone. The drone footage, deleted. The cloud backup, empty. Her car's GPS history had been wiped, but her documents folder contained one new file, rains_c_event_log.pdf. Clara opened it. Inside was a complete dossier on her. Her education, employment history, security clearance application, every FOIA request she'd ever filed, her home address, her parents' names, her college transcripts, photos of her at work, at home, driving her car. The last page contained a single line. Department 7 extends its regards. Below that, a phone number. Clara stared at the screen. They weren't threatening her. They were introducing themselves. She closed the laptop and sat in her car, watching trucks rumble past on the interstate. She should run, should disappear, should take Crowley's advice and forget everything. Instead, she took out her burner phone and dialed the number. It rang once. "Hello, Clara." The voice was male, calm, professional. "We've been expecting your call." The man on the phone called himself Agent D. Marrow. He didn't offer a first name, didn't explain what the D stood for. He spoke with the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering information that wouldn't be questioned. "You've done impressive work," he said. "Most people stop after the first warning. You kept going." "Who are you?" "I think you already know the answer to that. Department 7, in a manner of speaking. The designation is more of a filing convention than an official name. We operate under various administrative codes depending on the fiscal quarter and operational requirements. You're telling me you're real. We're as real as we need to be. Would you like to meet in person? I think we have things to discuss." Clara's instinct was to refuse. Every thriller she'd ever read, every conspiracy documentary she'd watched, taught her that accepting such an invitation was how people vanished. But she'd already crossed too many lines. They had her home address, they had her files. Running wouldn't help. Where? Denver. Tomorrow. There's a federal building at 1961 Stout Street. 4th floor, room 447. Come alone. And if I don't, then you'll continue your investigation, we'll continue monitoring you, and eventually you'll end up somewhere unfortunate. I'd prefer to have a conversation instead. The line went dead. Clara drove to Denver, arriving late that night. She checked into a hotel downtown and didn't sleep. Instead, she spent hours reviewing everything she knew, preparing questions, trying to anticipate what Marrow would say. At 9 a.m., she stood outside 1961 Stout Street. The building looked like any other federal office. Grey concrete, minimal windows, a bored security guard at the front desk. She showed her ID, stated she had an appointment on the 4th floor, and was waved through without question. The elevator opened onto a quiet hallway. Room 447 was at the end, unmarked except for the number. Clara knocked. "Come in." The room was small, furnished with a metal desk, 2 chairs, and nothing else. No computer, no phone, no files. Agent D. Marrow sat behind the desk. He was perhaps 50, with greying hair and glasses, dressed in a plain grey suit. He looked like an accountant. "Miss Rains." "Please sit." Clara took the chair opposite him. "You're Department 7. I represent the organisational structure currently designated as such. Though, as I mentioned, the designation is temporary. Next quarter will likely operate under a different budget code, embedded within a different parent agency. Why the shell game? Accountability is complicated when your mission involves information control. We exist in the gaps between agencies. Sometimes we're DOE responding to radiological incidents. Sometimes we're USGS investigating seismic anomalies. Sometimes we're CDC handling contagious cognitive phenomena. The designation changes. The work remains the same. Contagious cognitive phenomena? Marrow folded his hands on the desk. Reality is more fragile than most people understand. Occasionally events occur that contradict accepted physics. Not alien invasions or supernatural occurrences, just anomalies, time distortions, energy blooms that don't match any known source, mass hallucinations with no chemical basis. These events create cognitive dissonance. If left unaddressed, they spread. People talk. Stories grow. Belief systems fracture. So you erase the evidence. We contextualize it. We provide plausible explanations that maintain social cohesion. A meteor becomes a weather phenomenon. A mass hallucination becomes contaminated water. Missing time becomes hypothermia. We're not hiding the truth. We're preventing chaos. Clara leaned forward. You're rewriting reality. We're maintaining consensus. There's a difference. Is there? Marrow opened a desk drawer and removed a folder. He placed it in front of Clara. Before we continue, I want to show you something. She opened the folder. Inside was a photograph. Herself, maybe 9 years old, standing in front of a suburban house. Behind her, partially visible in the background, was a black SUV with a circular badge on the door. What is this? North Carolina, 2003. Your neighborhood experienced a localized temporal distortion. 17 families reported identical dreams. Clocks ran backward for 40 minutes, and your father called 911 claiming he'd lived the same Tuesday twice. We responded. We cleaned up, and we ensured no one remembered clearly enough to spread the story. Clara stared at the photo. She had no memory of this, but she remembered that house, that year, and she remembered her father acting strangely for weeks afterward. You did something to my father. We offered him a choice, the same choice I'm offering you now. Which is? Marrow retrieved another folder. Department 7 is always looking for analysts, people who can see patterns others miss, people who are already compromised, who've seen too much to go back to normal life. You're exactly the kind of person we need. You want me to join you. I want to offer you a future. You can't unknow what you've discovered. You can't publish it. No one would believe you, and we'd intervene before any story gained traction. You can't run. We'll find you. You can't hide. You already live in our database. But you can be useful. You can help us maintain stability. You can be part of the solution instead of a problem to be solved. And if I refuse? Marrow's expression didn't change. We have a process for that. Neural interference technology, derived from DARPA's cognitive security research. It's not mind control. It's more like data reconciliation. We can't erase specific memories, but we can make them feel unimportant, like a dream you can't quite remember. Within a week, you'd lose interest in this investigation. You'd move on, get a new job, maybe relocate, live a normal life. You'd lobotomize me. We'd help you forget an obsession that's destroying your life. Many people find it merciful. Clara stood. Her chair scraped against the floor. I need time to think. Of course. Take 24 hours. I'll be here tomorrow, same time. Come back with your decision or don't come back at all. Either way, the outcome is already determined. She walked out without responding. Clara spent the day driving aimlessly through Denver, trying to process what Marrow had told her. Every option led to the same place. Department 7 controlled the outcome. Join them or forget them. Comply or be erased. There was no third path. She thought about her father. Had he been given the same choice? Had he accepted the erasure, traded his memories for peace? She called her parents that evening. Clara, honey, is everything okay? Her mother sounded worried. I'm fine. Is Dad there? He's in the garage. Hold on. Her father's voice came on the line, warm and familiar. Hey kiddo, what's up? Dad, do you remember anything strange happening when I was 9? In North Carolina? A long pause. Strange how? I don't know, just anything unusual, around the neighborhood. Can't think of anything. Why? No reason, just something I was trying to remember. They talked for a few more minutes. Superficial conversation, before Clara hung up. Her father remembered nothing. Either the Department 7 had been thorough, or he'd chosen to forget. That night, Clara sat in her hotel room with her laptop staring at the empty folders where her evidence had been. She could walk away, accept the erasure, wake up in a week with no memory of Department 7, No obsession with patterns, no fear of unmarked vehicles. The normal life. Or she could join them, become part of the system that erased truth, help maintain the comfortable lie that kept society stable. Neither option felt like freedom. At midnight she made her decision. She didn't go back to room 447 the next morning. Instead, she drove to the airport and bought a ticket to Seattle. She turned off her phone, paid cash for everything, and tried to disappear into the crowd. For 3 days, it worked. She stayed in cheap motels, avoided cameras, moved constantly. But on the 4th day, she woke up in a Portland motel room and knew immediately that something was wrong. The room felt different. Her belongings were arranged slightly differently than she'd left them. Her laptop was closed, she'd left it open. She tried to turn it on. Dead battery, though. She'd charged it overnight. Clara grabbed her bag and headed for the door. In the parking lot, her rental car was gone. In its place, a taxi sat with its engine running. The driver rolled down the window. "Miss Rains, I'm here to take you to the airport." "I didn't call a taxi." "I know. Please get in." Clara ran. She made it 2 blocks before exhaustion overtook her. She collapsed on a park bench, gasping, and realized she couldn't remember when she'd last eaten. How long had she been running? 3 days? 4? The taxi pulled up beside her. The driver got out. Not a driver. Agent Marrow, wearing casual clothes, looking concerned. "You chose the hard way," he said. "Most people do." Clara woke up in a white room. Not a hospital. There were no medical instruments, no monitors. Just a bed, a chair, a small table. The door had no handle on the inside. Marrow entered an hour later, carrying a paper cup of coffee. "How are you feeling?" Clara said nothing. "You've been here for 2 days. We've been monitoring your vitals, making sure you're healthy. No one's hurt you." "Where am I?" "A federal medical facility, location classified. You're not a prisoner, Clara. You're a patient receiving treatment for acute stress disorder." "I don't have a stress disorder. Your behaviour suggests otherwise. 3 days of paranoid flight, irregular sleeping patterns, signs of psychosis. It's all documented." He set down the coffee. "This is what I was trying to avoid." "You made it harder than it needed to be." "What did you do to me?" "We initiated the reconciliation process. It takes about a week. Your memories of the Department 7 aren't gone. They're just becoming less important, like background noise. Soon you won't care about any of this." Clara tried to focus, but her thoughts felt slippery. She could remember Thornton, the photographs, Crowley's trailer. But the urgency was fading. Why had she been so obsessed? It seemed distant now, unimportant. "Fight it," she whispered to herself. "Don't," Marrow said gently. "It's easier if you let go." Over the next 3 days, Clara's grip on her investigation weakened. She could recall facts, but couldn't summon the drive to care. Department 7 existed. So what? Lots of classified programs existed. Why had she thought it mattered? On the 6th day, Marrow visited again. "We're releasing you tomorrow. You'll have a new job waiting, data analysis for a private firm in Austin. Good pay, benefits, fresh start. Your apartment in Arlington has been cleared out. Your parents have been told you're relocating for work. Everything's arranged. What about my files, my research?" "Gone. We've removed every trace. It never happened." Clara nodded. That seemed reasonable. But that night, alone in the white room, a fragment of memory surfaced. Her father, speaking to her when she was 9. "Sometimes you have to remember things even when people tell you to forget. Pattern recognition isn't just about what you see, it's about what you hold on to." Had he said that? Or was she imagining it? She closed her eyes and tried to visualize her evidence. The 3 incidents. ENV071-KD, the badge numbers 7-13-4, the man waving at her in Thornton, the email, "You're very good at this." By morning the details had faded to impressions, but something remained. A feeling that she'd discovered something important. Clara was released on a Tuesday morning. They returned her belongings, her phone, her wallet, her clothes. Her laptop was gone, replaced with a new one. They gave her a plane ticket to Austin and an employment packet for her new job. She arrived in Austin that afternoon. Her new apartment was furnished, her name already on the mailbox. Her employer, a tech firm she'd never heard of, welcomed her enthusiastically. Her new supervisor explained her role, analysing market trends, nothing classified, nothing complicated. For 2 weeks Clara lived normally. She worked, grocery shopped, watched television. Sometimes she'd catch herself staring at nothing, feeling like she'd forgotten something important, but the feeling always passed. Then, one evening, she received an email. The sender was listed as Federal Records Archive. The subject line, FOIA request reminder. She opened it. Your request for records regarding incident ENV071KD remains pending. Estimated processing time 6 to 8 months. You will be notified when documents are available. Clara stared at the email. ENV071KD. The code meant nothing to her. She didn't remember filing any FOIA request. She should delete it. Instead, she searched her deleted emails, found nothing. Searched her browser history, nothing. But the code stuck in her mind. ENV071KD. She opened a private browser window and typed it in. No results, just like before. Before when? Clara closed her laptop and went to bed, but she didn't sleep. 3 months later, a junior analyst at NOAA named David Park was processing routine satellite data when his system flagged an anomalous file. Department 7 event rains.log. He clicked it. Inside were coordinates, timestamps and incident codes. One entry caught his attention. A predicted meteor sighting in rural Wyoming, scheduled for 3 days from now. David frowned. Predicted meteor sightings weren't part of NOAA's standard data. He checked the file's metadata, created 3 months ago, last modified yesterday. He tried to trace the file's origin, but the access logs instantly deleted themselves. David should have reported it to his supervisor, should have followed proper protocol for unexplained data. Instead, he wrote down the coordinates. 3 days later, he took a personal day and drove to Wyoming. He arrived at the coordinates just after sunset and parked on a hilltop overlooking empty grassland. At 9:47 p.m, lights appeared in the sky, vertical pillars just like the file had predicted. At 10:15 p.m, 3 black SUVs arrived and parked in the field below. David grabbed his camera and started taking photos. One of the figures looked up toward his position. Even in darkness, David felt seen. The figure raised one hand and waved. Clara sat in her Austin apartment, unable to shake the feeling that she'd forgotten something crucial. She'd started keeping a journal, writing down fragments of dreams that felt like memories, codes, numbers. A man in a grey suit offering her a choice. None of it made sense. But she'd learned to trust patterns even when she couldn't remember why. She opened her laptop and typed, Department 7. No results. She tried. ENV071KD, nothing, but her hands kept typing almost automatically. Department 7_event_rains.log, and somewhere in a classified server farm in Virginia, an automated alert triggered. A file had been accessed. Not by Clara Rains, her credentials had been deactivated months ago, but the search query had been logged. Agent DiMauro received the notification on his secure phone. He read it, sighed, and opened a new case file. Subject, Rains Clara, status, recursive awareness, recommendation, enhanced reconciliation. He closed the file and made a call. We have a problem, he said. The Rains case isn't resolved. She's starting to remember. How is that possible? I don't know, but we need to bring her back in. What about the other one? Park? Same protocol. They're both exhibiting pattern recognition despite treatment. It's as if the signal is calling to them. Then we need to find the source of the signal. Marrow looked out his office window at the Denver skyline. We've been trying for 70 years. Whatever creates these events doesn't want to be found. It wants to be seen, and it chooses who sees it. He hung up and pulled up Clara's file again. Her photo stared back at him from the screen. Taken at age 9, standing in front of a suburban house, a Department 7 vehicle visible in the background. Even then she'd been watching. Some patterns couldn't be erased. Some people couldn't forget. And somewhere in the American night another set of lights appeared in the sky, calling to those who could see. Department 7 would respond. They always did, but the pattern would continue. It always did. What if the most powerful secret society in history wasn't the Illuminati, the Knights Templar, or even the modern Freemasons, but three men whose names have been deliberately erased from every record? Tonight, we dive deep into the digital shadows to uncover a conspiracy so intricate, so carefully hidden, that discovering it might be the last thing you ever do. Before we begin, what conspiracy would you like us to investigate next? Ancient bloodlines controlling world governments, the real purpose behind social media algorithms, or perhaps something even darker lurking in the depths of the internet? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories for more late-night investigations that will keep you awake long after the credits roll. The blue glow of Dorian Cade's monitors cast long shadows across his cluttered apartment at 3:47 a.m. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic skyline around his workstation, where 4 screens displayed cascading lines of encrypted data. This was his domain, the digital underworld where secrets lived and died in streams of code. Dorian had always been drawn to the spaces between spaces, the forgotten corners of the internet where truth hid behind layers of encryption. By day, he was just another cybersecurity analyst for Titan Defense Systems, debugging firewalls and hunting malware. But by night, he was something else entirely, a digital archaeologist, excavating buried information from the deepest recesses of the web. Tonight's target was a seemingly innocuous file archive he'd discovered on a defunct server that once belonged to the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. The files were old, some dating back to the early digitization efforts of the 1990s, when historical documents were first being converted from physical to digital formats. Most of it was mundane: meeting minutes, membership rolls, financial records, the kind of material that would put most people to sleep. But Dorian wasn't most people. As his decryption algorithms worked through the data, something unusual caught his attention. Buried within a folder labelled Historical Correspondence MISC was a file that didn't match the others. The metadata was wrong, the encryption was different, and when he finally cracked it open, what he found made his pulse quicken. It was a single image, a symbol he had never seen before. 3 interlocked triangles formed an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and move in his peripheral vision. Each triangle was perfectly equilateral, but where they intersected, strange geometric forms emerged, creating an optical illusion that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Beneath the symbol was a single line of text, the triune accord established. 1717 AVCRJH. Dorian leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against his desk. 1717. That was the same year the Grand Lodge of London was established, marking the beginning of organised Freemasonry. But what was the Triune Accord, and who were AV, CR and JH? He screenshotted the image and began reverse searching it through every database he could access. Nothing. No matches, no similar images, no references anywhere on the indexed internet. It was as if this symbol existed in a void, completely disconnected from the digital world. The mystery deepened when he examined the file's digital signature. According to the metadata, this document had been accessed and modified hundreds of times over the past 30 years, but always by anonymous users with no traceable digital footprints. Someone, or multiple someones, had been maintaining this file, keeping it alive in the digital space while ensuring it remained invisible to casual observers. Dorian's hands moved instinctively to his keyboard. He had found something that wasn't supposed to be found, touched something that wasn't supposed to be touched. And now, he couldn't let it go. The hunt had begun. 3 days of relentless searching had yielded fragments, tantalizing pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. Dorian had barely slept, surviving on caffeine and the electric thrill of discovery. His apartment had transformed into a conspiracy theorist's dream, with printed documents taped to every available wall surface and red string connecting seemingly random data points. The breakthrough came when he cross-referenced the initials AV, CR, and JH with historical Masonic records from the early 18th century. Traditional sources yielded nothing, but when he dug into the darker corners of academic databases, forgotten doctoral dissertations, obscure historical journals, private collections that had been digitized but never properly indexed, patterns began to emerge. In a 1987 thesis on esoteric influences in early American politics, he found a footnote referencing 3 mysterious benefactors who had allegedly provided funding for the construction of several early American government buildings. The author had dismissed the claims as unsubstantiated rumours, but had noted that the same 3 sets of initials appeared in financial records from Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston between 1720 and 1750. A deeper dive into banking archives from the period revealed something extraordinary. Dorian discovered a series of encrypted letters between European aristocrats and early American colonists, all revolving around something called the Doctrine of Quiet Influence. The letters, written in a cipher that had taken him 2 full days to crack, described a methodology for guiding human behaviour through subtle manipulation of symbols, language, and social structures. But it was the names that made his blood run cold. The letters were signed with the same initials, AV, CR, and JH. According to the correspondence, these 3 men weren't just wealthy benefactors. They were the architects of a new form of power, one that didn't rely on armies or political office, but on the manipulation of human psychology itself. They had studied the old mystery schools, the ancient techniques of persuasion and control, and had adapted them for a new age. One letter, dated 1734, was particularly chilling. The masses believe they choose their own thoughts, their own desires, their own leaders. They do not understand that choice itself can be manufactured, shaped like clay in the hands of those who understand the deeper mechanics of the human mind. We 3 have laid the foundation stones. Future generations will build upon our work without ever knowing our names. Dorian printed out the letter and pinned it to his wall next to the symbol of the 3 interlocked triangles. The pattern was starting to make sense. These weren't just random geometric shapes. They were a visual representation of the 3 founders' methodology. Each triangle represented a different sphere of influence: political, economic, and cultural. Where they intersected, control was established. But who were they? The initials were all he had to go on, and despite hours of searching, he couldn't find any historical figures from the period whose names matched. It was as if they had been deliberately erased from the historical record. That's when he made his second major discovery. Hidden within the financial records was a reference to something called the Lodge of 3 Pillars. Not an official Masonic lodge, but what appeared to be a secret organisation within the larger Masonic structure. The 3 pillars, according to the documents, were AV, CR, and JH themselves. Dorian's excitement was tempered by a growing sense of unease. He was uncovering something that had been buried for nearly 3 centuries, something that powerful people had gone to great lengths to hide. The deeper he dug, the more he realised that this wasn't just history. It was a blueprint, a framework that was still being used. As the sun rose over the city, casting golden light through his apartment windows, Dorian stared at the wall of evidence he'd assembled. The 3 Masons, as he had begun calling them, had created more than just a secret society. They had engineered a system of control that evolved and adapted over centuries, invisible but omnipresent. And now he was beginning to understand how it worked. The realization hit Dorian like a physical blow as he sat in his favourite coffee shop, laptop open, surrounded by the mundane chatter of the morning commuters. He had been analysing media patterns for the past week, looking for connections to the doctrine of quiet influence, when the data suddenly cohered into a terrifying picture. It was everywhere. The three interlocked triangles, the symbol of the triune accord, weren't just hidden in dusty historical archives. They were embedded in the fabric of modern culture, disguised and abstracted but unmistakably present. Movie logos, corporate brands, architectural designs, even the layout of popular websites, all contained subtle variations of the three-triangle pattern. Dorian's hand shook as he scrolled through his analysis. He had developed an algorithm to detect geometric patterns that matched the mathematical relationships inherent in the original symbol. The results were overwhelming. Major Hollywood studios, Fortune 500 companies, news networks and social media platforms all incorporated elements of the design into their visual identity. But it went deeper than logos and branding. The doctrine of quiet influence, as described in the 18th century letters, relied on three key principles: repetition, authority, and emotional resonance. Dorian began to see these principles reflected in everything from political campaigns to advertising strategies to social media algorithms. The coffee in his cup grew cold as he dove deeper into the pattern recognition data. Primetime television shows contained dialogue structures that followed specific linguistic patterns outlined in the historical documents. Popular songs used chord progressions and lyrical frameworks that aligned with the emotional manipulation techniques described in the letters. Even children's programming seemed to incorporate subliminal messaging systems derived from the Three Masons' psychological frameworks. The most disturbing discovery came when he analysed news broadcasts from the past decade. Major networks, regardless of their political orientation, used nearly identical linguistic structures when reporting on controversial topics. The language was designed to create emotional responses that bypassed rational analysis, exactly as the doctrine had prescribed. Dorian closed his laptop and walked home in a daze. His apartment felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge he carried. Every advertisement on the subway, every billboard along the street, every notification on his phone, they all looked different through the lens of what he now understood. That evening he began compiling a comprehensive digital archive of his findings. If what he suspected was true, if the Three Masons' influence had not only survived but thrived in the modern era, then someone needed to document it. He created encrypted backups of everything: the historical documents, his analysis algorithms, the pattern recognition data, his own notes and theories. As he worked, a new question haunted him. If the Three Masons had successfully embedded their control systems into modern society, who was running those systems now? The original architects had died centuries ago, but their work lived on. Someone was maintaining it, updating it, ensuring its continued effectiveness. Dorian pulled up recent financial records from some of the corporations that featured the strongest pattern matches. Shell companies, offshore accounts, anonymous investors. The ownership structures were labyrinthine, designed to obscure rather than reveal. But patterns emerged here too. The same investment firms appeared again and again, the same legal structures, the same carefully anonymized board members. It was a network, vast and interconnected, spanning industries and continents, and at its heart Dorian was beginning to suspect were the modern inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. He named his archive the Veil Project and began preparing it for release. The world had a right to know about the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, but as he prepared to upload his findings to multiple whistleblower platforms, his computer screen flickered. For just a moment, the three interlocked triangles appeared in the corner of his monitor. There and gone so quickly he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. Almost. The message appeared in Dorian's private encrypted chat channel at 2:33 a.m. exactly 72 hours after he had discovered the pattern recognition data. The sender was listed as anonymous, but the message itself was anything but anonymous. It was clearly directed at him, containing details that only someone who had been watching his research could know. The three still watch. Stop now, Dorian. Dorian stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He had been so careful, using multiple layers of encryption, routing his traffic through a dozen different proxy servers, maintaining operational security that should have made him invisible to all but the most sophisticated surveillance operations. But they had found him. He ran a full system scan, checking for malware, backdoors, any sign of compromise. His security software came back clean, but Dorian knew that meant nothing. If someone had the resources to track his research, despite his precautions, they would also have the resources to hide their presence on his system. The paranoia began slowly, like a low-grade fever. Every notification on his phone made him jump. Every knock on his apartment door sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. He started noticing things that might have been coincidences. The same car parked outside his building for 3 days, a man in a coffee shop who looked away too quickly when Dorian glanced in his direction. The second message arrived 48 hours later, this time containing a photograph. It showed Dorian sitting at his computer, taken from inside his own apartment. The timestamp indicated it had been captured the previous night while he worked on the Veil project. Someone had been inside his home. Dorian immediately conducted a physical sweep of his apartment. He found the device hidden inside the frame of his bedroom mirror. A microcamera so small he almost missed it, connected to a transmitter that was broadcasting his every move to an unknown receiver. But the camera was just the beginning. A more thorough search revealed audio pickups in his kitchen and living room, keystroke loggers attached to his computer equipment, and something that looked like a network tap spliced into his Ethernet cable. His entire life was being monitored. The rational part of his mind told him to stop, to destroy his research and return to his normal life. But Dorian had never been particularly rational. The invasion of his privacy, rather than deterring him, only confirmed that he was onto something significant. You didn't deploy military-grade surveillance equipment against someone who was chasing shadows. He began operating under the assumption that everything he did was being watched. He established new research protocols, using air-gapped computers and physical storage devices that never connected to the internet. He moved his most sensitive work to a storage unit across town, accessible only by physical key. He varied his routines, took different routes to work, paid for everything in cash, but the watchers adapted too. His work computer at Titan Defense Systems began experiencing mysterious glitches. Files would disappear and reappear. His security clearance was subjected to routine reviews that felt anything but routine. Colleagues who had been friendly for years suddenly seemed distant, their conversations stilted and careful. The third message was different. Instead of a text, he received a link to a news article about a cybersecurity researcher in Seattle who had died in a car accident. The researcher, according to the article, had been working on sensitive projects related to digital privacy and surveillance. The accident had occurred at 3:17 a.m. on a straight stretch of highway, with no other vehicles involved. Dorian noticed that the timestamp on the article was exactly 3 minutes before he received the link. The message was clear. This could happen to you. But by then, Dorian was too deep to surface. The Veil project had expanded beyond his original scope, becoming an obsession that consumed his waking hours and invaded his dreams. He had uncovered something that went beyond historical curiosity or academic research. The Freemasons weren't just a fascinating historical footnote, they were the architects of a system that was still actively shaping human society. And someone was willing to kill to keep that secret hidden. That night, Dorian made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to silence him, they would have to find him first. He began preparations for what he called Project Deep Dive, a final comprehensive investigation that would either expose the truth about the Three Masons or confirm his own paranoid delusions. Either way, he would have his answer. As he packed his research materials and prepared to disappear into the digital underground, Dorian caught a glimpse of his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He looked like a man who had seen too much, learned too much, gone too far down a rabbit hole that might not have an exit. But he also looked like a man who was finally fully alive. The abandoned subway station beneath downtown had been closed since 1962, but Dorian's research had revealed that its tunnels connected to a network of service corridors that ran beneath several government buildings. More importantly, the location offered something he desperately needed: complete isolation from digital surveillance. He had spent 3 days preparing his mobile command centre. Military-grade Faraday cages protected his equipment from electronic monitoring. Satellite internet connections routed through multiple international proxies provided connectivity that would be nearly impossible to trace. Battery packs and portable generators ensured he could operate for weeks without external power. The setup looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic thriller, and Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that it might represent his future. A life spent in the shadows, hunted by forces he barely understood. But it was here, in the depths beneath the city, that he finally breached what he had come to think of as the vault. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While analysing the financial networks he had discovered, Dorian noticed that several key transactions were processed through a server cluster housed in the Smithsonian Institution's digital archive facility. The Smithsonian servers weren't just repositories for historical documents. They were hosting active financial systems for the network of corporations connected to the Three Masons pattern. Using exploit tools from his defense contractor days, Dorian tunneled into the archive system through a maintenance portal that had been forgotten during a security update. What he found inside defied his wildest expectations. The vault wasn't a single database, it was an entire hidden internet, a shadow network that existed parallel to the visible web. Accessible only through specific cryptographic keys that appeared to be distributed to a select group of users, the vault contained terabytes of data spanning 3 centuries. The most recent files were mind-bending. Detailed psychological profiles of world leaders, media manipulation strategies updated in real time, algorithmic frameworks for managing public opinion through social media platforms. But it was the historical archives that truly shocked him. Digitized manuscripts described secret chambers beneath Washington, D.C., built during the Capitol's construction according to specifications provided by the Three Masons. The chambers weren't just meeting spaces. They were designed as psychological amplification devices, using acoustic engineering and symbolic geometry to enhance the persuasive power of those who spoke within them. Architectural drawings showed that the entire layout of the Capitol building, the White House, and the Supreme Court formed a massive version of the 3 interlocked triangles when viewed from above. The buildings weren't just symbols of American democracy, they were active components in a system designed to channel and focus political influence. But the most disturbing documents dealt with something called the Great Work, an ongoing project to gradually reshape human consciousness through systematic manipulation of culture, education, and information systems. The Great Work wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It was presented as a form of guided evolution, helping humanity develop according to principles established by the Three Masons. According to the documents, every major social movement of the past 2 centuries had been either initiated or co-opted by the inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. Wars, revolutions, technological breakthroughs, cultural shifts, all were pieces in a vast game being played by invisible hands. And Dorian discovered that modern political speeches were crafted using linguistic frameworks, derived directly from the original doctrine of quiet influence. Presidential debates, congressional hearings, Supreme Court arguments, all followed scripted patterns designed to produce predetermined emotional responses in viewers. Entertainment media was even more thoroughly controlled. Hollywood studios, record labels, publishing houses, all were connected to the network through complex ownership structures. Popular culture wasn't a reflection of society's values, it was a tool for shaping those values. As Dorian delved deeper into the vault, he began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just a historical conspiracy, it was a living system, constantly evolving and adapting to new technologies and social conditions. The Three Masons had died centuries ago, but their work lived on through institutions, traditions, and methodologies that had become so embedded in society that they were virtually invisible. The most chilling realization came when he discovered his own file in the Vault's database. They had been monitoring him for months, tracking his research, analysing his psychological profile, preparing countermeasures. His investigation hadn't been a secret quest for truth, it had been a carefully observed experiment. But why let him discover so much? Why allow him to penetrate their most sensitive archives? The answer came in a document titled Protocol 7, Asset Integration. Dorian's blood ran cold as he read the clinical assessment of his psychological profile, his motivations, his likely responses to various stimuli. He wasn't just a threat to be eliminated, he was a potential asset to be recruited. The file indicated that his research skills and psychological profile made him an ideal candidate for voluntary integration into their network. His investigation of the three Masons hadn't been a violation of their security, it had been an audition. As this understanding washed over him, Dorian noticed something that made his hands shake. The documents he was accessing contained metadata signatures, hidden markers that traced every query back to his specific location and identity. By exploring the vault, he wasn't just learning their secrets, he was leaving digital fingerprints that proved he had been there. The final piece of the puzzle revealed itself at 4:47 a.m. on what Dorian would later realise was his last night of freedom. He had been analysing the most recent uploads to the vault, real-time data feeds that showed the three Masons' influence network in active operation. What he discovered was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. The network wasn't just influencing culture and politics, it was actively shaping reality itself through coordinated manipulation of information systems. Social media algorithms were tweaked to promote specific narratives. Search engine results were subtly adjusted to guide public research toward predetermined conclusions. News recommendation systems were programmed to create echo chambers that reinforced desired belief patterns. But the most sophisticated element was something they called consensus engineering. By carefully managing the flow of information across multiple platforms simultaneously, the network could create the illusion that certain ideas were organically emerging from grassroots movements, when in fact they were being systematically planted and cultivated. Dorian watched in real time as a coordinated information campaign was launched across dozens of platforms. A political controversy that would dominate news cycles for weeks was being artificially created through carefully timed leaks, strategic social media posts, and coordinated commentary from influencers who probably didn't even realise they were part of the operation. The level of coordination was staggering. Television networks, newspapers, social media platforms, and even individual bloggers were all receiving talking points through channels that appeared unconnected but were actually part of a single centralised command structure. He began documenting everything, screenshotting real-time operations, copying database entries, building an irrefutable record of the network in action. This was the smoking gun he had been looking for, proof that modern society was being manipulated by invisible forces operating on a scale that dwarfed anything in history. But as he prepared to copy the most damaging files to his secure storage devices, Dorian noticed something that made his blood freeze. The documents he was accessing contained more than just information. They contained active code that was executing on his system every time he opened a file. He ran an immediate diagnostic and discovered the horrifying truth. Every document in the vault was embedded with sophisticated tracking malware. Not only did the system know exactly what he had accessed, it had been installing backdoors and surveillance tools on his equipment from the moment he had first breached their security. His air-gapped computers weren't air-gapped anymore. His encrypted storage devices were compromised. His Faraday cages were useless against software that was already inside his systems. But the worst revelation was yet to come. As he traced the malware's network connections, Dorian realised that his entire investigation had been orchestrated from the beginning. The original files he had discovered in the Masonic Lodge archive. They had been placed there deliberately, designed to attract someone with his specific skill set and psychological profile. The research trails he had followed, the connections he had discovered, the patterns he had uncovered, All of it had been a carefully constructed puzzle, leading him step by step to this moment. He hadn't been investigating the three Masons, he had been recruited by them. The recruitment wasn't complete yet. According to the protocols he found in his own file, the final step required a conscious choice. He could accept integration into their network, becoming a willing participant in the great work, or he could face the consequences of possessing knowledge that wasn't meant for outsiders. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new message appeared on his screen. Dorian, you have seen behind the veil. There are only two paths forward. Choose wisely. Below the message were two links. The first was labelled integration. The second was labelled termination. Dorian stared at the screen, his mind racing through the implications of everything he had discovered. The three Masons weren't the villains in this story, at least not from their perspective. They saw themselves as shepherds of human civilization, guiding society toward what they believed was a better future. The manipulation, the control, the systematic shaping of human consciousness, all of it was presented as necessary stewardship of a species too chaotic and self-destructive to govern itself effectively. But Dorian couldn't shake the image of humanity as a vast puppet show, with invisible hands pulling strings that the puppets couldn't even see. Was guided evolution really better than free will? Was managed consciousness preferable to authentic chaos? The choice before him wasn't just about his own survival. It was about what kind of world he wanted to live in, and what kind of person he wanted to be within that world. As he reached for his mouse to make his selection, Dorian heard something that made his blood run cold. Sirens in the distance, growing closer. Time was up. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel above was unmistakable. Heavy boots, moving with military precision, getting closer with each passing second. Dorian's hands flew across his keyboard as he initiated emergency protocols, wiping drives, destroying evidence, preparing for what he now realized was inevitable. The sirens had been a psychological prompt designed to create urgency and force a hasty decision. The real trap was much more elegant than simple law enforcement intervention. As Dorian frantically tried to secure his data, he discovered that his internet connection had been severed, not blocked, completely terminated at the infrastructure level. His backup satellite connections were jammed. His cellular network showed full signal strength but couldn't establish data connections. Even his emergency radio beacon was transmitting into empty air, its signals absorbed by sophisticated countermeasures he couldn't detect, but could feel pressing in around him like invisible walls. The isolation was complete and professional. Whoever was coming for him had surrounded him not just physically, but digitally, cutting off every possible avenue of communication or escape. But Dorian had one final card to play. Before establishing his underground command center, he had prepared a dead man's switch, an automated system that would release his entire archive if he failed to check in within a specific time window. The system was housed on a server cluster in Eastern Europe, completely disconnected from his current location and impossible to trace back to him through conventional means. At least that's what he had believed. As he tried to access the dead man's switch, Dorian discovered that it too had been compromised. The activation codes had been changed, the server locations had been altered, and his backup authentication systems had been systematically disabled. Somehow they had anticipated and countered even his most paranoid contingency plans. The footsteps stopped directly above his hiding place. In the silence that followed, Dorian finally understood the true nature of the trap. He hadn't just been recruited, he had been studied, analysed, and predicted with mechanical precision. Every move he had made, every precaution he had taken, every paranoid contingency he had prepared, had been anticipated and accounted for. His investigation hadn't been a threat to their operations, it had been a demonstration of their capabilities. A voice echoed down from the tunnel above, calm and professional. "Mr. Cade, we need to talk." Dorian looked around his underground command centre. The sophisticated equipment, the military-grade security measures, the careful preparations that had taken weeks to implement. All of it was useless now. He had been allowed to build this fortress so that they could demonstrate how easily it could be bypassed. The voice continued, "Your research has been impressive. Your skills are exactly what we've been looking for. But the recruitment process needs to be completed according to protocol." Protocol. Everything with them was protocol, systematic and methodical. Even rebellion had to follow their rules, serve their purposes, advance their agenda. As the first figures began descending into his underground sanctuary, Dorian made one final desperate attempt to access his archive. If he could just upload something, anything, to prove that the three Masons were real and active, maybe someone else would continue the investigation. But his screens had already gone dark. His equipment was shutting down in sequence, responding to override commands that bypassed every security system he had installed. They weren't just capturing him, they were demonstrating complete dominance over his digital domain. The lead figure removed their helmet, revealing a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a patient smile. She looked more like a librarian than a Black Ops operative, but her presence commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Hello, Dorian," she said warmly. "My name is Dr. Ellen Drew, and I represent the contemporary stewards of the great work. You've impressed us greatly with your research, but I'm afraid you've also created a security situation that needs to be resolved." Dorian found his voice. "You mean eliminated?" Dr. Drew shook her head. "Integration, actually. Your psychological profile suggests you'd be much more valuable as a willing participant than as a cautionary tale. The choice is still yours, but I should mention that the termination option from earlier was never really on the table. We've invested too much in your development to waste that potential." As she spoke, Dorian realised that even his moment of apparent choice had been an illusion. The integration process had already begun the moment he first accessed their files. Every revelation, every discovery, every moment of apparent rebellion had been carefully orchestrated to bring him to this point. He wasn't being recruited, he was being harvested. Dr. Drew gestured to the equipment surrounding them. "All of this will be preserved, of course. Your research will continue, but with proper resources and institutional support. The three Masons' work is too important to be left to individual initiative, no matter how talented." Dorian stared at the woman who held his future in her hands. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be experiencing a very realistic simulation of refusal, while your consciousness is gradually adjusted to accept integration. We've found that the illusion of choice makes the process more comfortable for everyone involved. The trap was perfect because it had no exit. Resistance would be futile because resistance was part of the design. Even this conversation, even his growing horror at the situation, was probably being factored into some psychological algorithm designed to optimize his eventual compliance." As the implication sank in, Dorian felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, but his attachment to the idea that any of this had ever been real. His investigation, his discoveries, his moment of revelation, all of it had been a carefully crafted performance designed to transform him into whatever they needed him to become. The three Masons weren't just controlling society, they were controlling him. And the most terrifying part was that he was beginning to understand why. 6 months after Dorian Cade disappeared from his apartment in the middle of the night, fragments of his research began surfacing on obscure internet forums. Anonymous uploads appeared on file-sharing networks, containing encrypted archives that told a story of conspiracy and control spanning 3 centuries. The uploads were sporadic and seemingly random. A few documents here, some analysis there, portions of what appeared to be a larger investigation into something called the Three Masons. The files generated intense discussion in certain corners of the internet. Conspiracy theorists, digital privacy advocates, and researchers into esoteric history all found elements that resonated with their particular interests. But the fragments raised more questions than they answered. The documentation was sophisticated enough to suggest serious research, but incomplete enough to prevent any definitive conclusions. The historical elements were intriguingly plausible, but unverifiable through conventional sources. The contemporary analysis contained insights into media manipulation and social control that seemed prescient, but could easily be dismissed as paranoid speculation. Some investigators tried to trace the uploads back to their source, but the digital trails led nowhere. The files appeared and disappeared from servers around the world, uploaded by anonymous accounts that vanished as quickly as they had been created. Whoever was releasing this information had sophisticated technical capabilities and an intimate understanding of how to remain invisible in the digital landscape. The mystery deepened when researchers noticed that the archive fragments contained embedded metadata, hidden signatures that seemed to reference additional materials that had never been released. The signatures suggested that what they were seeing was only a small portion of a much larger collection of evidence. But where was the rest of the archive? And who was controlling its release? Theories proliferated across discussion forums and social media platforms. Some believed that Dorian Cade had been silenced by the very forces he was investigating, and that the leaked materials were being released by automated systems he had established as insurance. Others suggested that the entire thing was an elaborate alternate reality game, designed to blur the lines between fiction and reality. A few researchers claimed to have identified patterns in the release schedule that aligned with significant political events or cultural developments. The fragments seemed to appear at moments when they would have maximum relevance to current affairs, as if someone was curating their release to maximize impact. But perhaps the most unsettling theory was that the leaks were intentional, not the work of a whistleblower or an automated system, but a deliberate information campaign designed to achieve some larger purpose. If the three Masons really existed, and if they really controlled information systems as thoroughly as the document suggested, then wouldn't they also control the narrative of their own exposure? Late-night researchers who delved too deeply into the Cade archive reported strange experiences, computer glitches that seemed too targeted to be random, internet searches that returned results that disappeared when accessed again, social media algorithms that seemed to actively suppress discussion of certain topics. Some claimed to have received anonymous messages warning them away from the investigation. Others reported that their research was being monitored by unknown parties. A few simply stopped posting one day, their accounts going silent without explanation. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Those who got closest to understanding the true scope of Dorian's discoveries seemed to encounter obstacles that discouraged further research. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by coincidence or technical malfunction. But the cumulative effect was to ensure that the investigation never reached critical mass. And so the mystery of Dorian Cade and the three Masons remained unsolved, existing in the liminal space between truth and fiction, between revelation and misdirection. The fragments continued to circulate, generating discussion and debate, but never quite coalescing into anything that could definitively prove or disprove the central claims. The most dedicated researchers began to notice something peculiar about their own investigations. The deeper they dug, the more they found themselves questioning not just the truth of Dorian's discoveries, but the nature of truth itself. If information could be so thoroughly controlled and manipulated, how could anyone be certain that their own thoughts and conclusions were authentic? One researcher, posting under the username Digital Veil, claimed to have reconstructed portions of Dorian's methodology and arrived at similar conclusions about media manipulation and social control, but when other investigators tried to verify the research, they found that the evidence cited by Digital Veil led to websites that no longer existed, documents that had been removed from archives, and source materials that seemed to vanish whenever anyone tried to access them independently. Was Digital Veil continuing Dorian's work, or was Digital Veil part of the very system Dorian had claimed to expose? The question became even more complex when Digital Veil began posting increasingly sophisticated analysis that seemed to predict social and political developments with uncanny accuracy. The posts described how specific news events would unfold, how public opinion would shift in response to carefully crafted messaging campaigns, and how seemingly unrelated cultural phenomena were actually coordinated elements of larger influence operations. And the predictions kept coming true. But rather than proving the existence of the Three Masons conspiracy, Digital Veil's accurate predictions only deepened the mystery. Were they based on genuine insider knowledge of how the system operated, Or were they simply the result of careful observation of existing patterns? Was Digital Veil exposing the conspiracy or participating in it? The final post from Digital Veil came exactly 1 year after Dorian Cade's disappearance. It consisted of a single image, the 3 interlocked triangles that had started Dorian's investigation, accompanied by a brief message. The research continues. The watchers become the watched. The hunters become the hunted. Truth is not a destination but a journey, and some journeys are designed to change the traveller more than the destination. Dorian understood this in the end. He chose integration not because he was forced to, but because he realised that the only way to truly oppose the system was to understand it from within. The 3 Masons were never the enemy. They were teachers, waiting for students ready to learn the hardest lesson of all. Power is not something you take. Power is something you become. The archive is complete, the circle is closed, the great work continues. DK. The message sparked intense debate across conspiracy forums and research communities. Was this really from Dorian Cade, suggesting that he had willingly joined the organisation he'd been investigating? Was it a fake message designed to discredit his research? Or was it something more subtle, a coded communication from someone operating deep within the system Dorian had tried to expose? No one could agree on the interpretation, and perhaps that was the point. The message was designed to be ambiguous, to raise questions rather than answer them, to ensure that the investigation would continue but never reach a definitive conclusion. In the months that followed, the Dorian Cade archive gradually faded from active discussion. New conspiracy theories emerged to capture the attention of digital investigators. New mysteries arose to challenge those who sought hidden truths. The 3 Masons, if they existed, returned to the shadows where they had always operated most effectively. But for those who had followed the investigation closely, something had changed. They found themselves looking at the world differently, noticing patterns they had never seen before, questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine. They began to see the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, even if they couldn't prove its existence to others. Some researchers reported that they had begun to incorporate elements of the doctrine of quiet influence into their own work, not to manipulate others, but to better understand how they themselves were being manipulated. They studied the psychological techniques described in Dorian's files, the linguistic frameworks, the symbolic systems, the methodologies for shaping human consciousness. A few claim to have achieved a kind of immunity to mass manipulation through this understanding. They described a state of hyper-awareness where they could observe the influence systems operating around them without being affected by them. They called it seeing through the veil. But others wondered if this supposed immunity was itself an illusion, if the system was sophisticated enough to make people believe they had escaped its influence, while actually drawing them deeper into its web. After all, what better way to control someone than to convince them they couldn't be controlled? The question that haunted all serious researchers into the Dorian Cade mystery was whether the investigation had revealed the truth about hidden systems of control, or whether it had been a demonstration of those systems in action. Had they uncovered a conspiracy, or had they been recruited into one? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility was that there was no meaningful difference between the 2 options. The final entry in what researchers believed to be Dorian's original archive was a single text file, uploaded anonymously to a dozen different platforms simultaneously. It contained no metadata, no digital signatures, no clues about its origin. The message was brief but haunting. If you are reading this, you have already been chosen. The investigation never ends. It only changes investigators. Welcome to the great work. Your orientation will begin shortly. Below the message was a simple instruction. Look around you. Really look. The signs are everywhere, once you know how to see them. And indeed, those who followed the instruction began to notice things. Symbols in corporate logos that matched patterns from the historical documents. Linguistic structures in news broadcasts that aligned with psychological manipulation frameworks. Social media algorithms that seem to nudge users towards specific conclusions without their awareness. The 3 Masons weren't hiding in the shadows, they were hiding in plain sight, their influence so thoroughly woven into the fabric of modern society that it had become invisible through ubiquity. They didn't need to silence investigators because they had created a world where the truth was indistinguishable from elaborate fiction. And perhaps that was the most elegant control system of all, a reality so thoroughly constructed that even those who glimpsed behind the veil couldn't be certain whether they had discovered the truth or been recruited to perpetuate a more sophisticated illusion. The three Masons, whether real or imagined, ancient or contemporary, had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had made the question of their existence irrelevant. In a world where information could be infinitely manipulated and human consciousness systematically shaped, the distinction between reality and carefully crafted narrative had ceased to matter. What mattered was the system itself, the vast, invisible architecture of influence that operated according to principles established centuries ago by three men whose names had been deliberately erased from history. They had created not just a secret society, but a new form of reality, one where truth was not discovered but constructed, where power was not seized but evolved, and where the ultimate conspiracy was the idea that conspiracies were necessary at all. In the end, Dorian Cade's investigation had revealed something far more profound than evidence of historical manipulation or contemporary control systems. It had revealed the fundamental malleability of human consciousness and the terrifying possibility that reality itself was subject to editing by those who understood the deeper mechanics of perception and belief. The three were not just in the past, they were here now, watching, guiding, shaping the very thoughts that their observers used to contemplate their existence. They had transcended the crude mechanics of conspiracy to achieve something approaching digital godhood, the power to define reality itself. And the most beautiful part of their design was that it didn't matter whether anyone believed in them or not. The system they had created was self-sustaining, self-correcting, and ultimately inescapable. The investigation was over. The great work continued, and somewhere in the space between digital shadows and physical reality, Dorian Cade smiled and began planning his next recruitment.